close your eyes for a second and try to imagine it. No cities, no roads, no farms stretching across valleys, no writing, no governments, no temples rising against the sky. Just wilderness, just earth and water and sky. Just humans moving through a world that belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. This is the world before civilization, before the first brick was laid, before the first king claimed a throne, before anyone thought to plant a seed and wait for it to grow. It's a world we've almost forgotten, buried under thousands of years of cities and empires and stories. But it was real. For most of human history, this was life, not the exception, the rule. For hundreds of thousands of years, people lived without borders, without laws, without the structures we take for granted today. They survived in ways we can barely imagine. And here's what keeps me awake at night. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They were creating art, forming bonds, raising children, exploring landscapes that had never seen human footprints. They built a kind of life that worked, that lasted longer than any civilization since. So, what did that world look like? What was it like to wake up in a time before everything we know existed? If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world. Anyway, let's go back. Way back. Before the pyramids, before the first cities of Mesopotamia, before anyone carved the first letter into clay or stone. We're talking about a time so distant that it feels almost mythical, but it was as real as the world you live in now. More real, maybe, because it lasted so much longer than anything that came after. Picture the Earth 60,000 years ago, 70,000, 100,000. The numbers get big, almost meaningless, but stay with me. Humans existed then. Not so different from you and me, not really. Same brain size, same capacity for thought, for love, for fear. But the world around them was completely alien to anything we'd recognize today. There were no roads because there was nowhere to go that required a road. No need for a path when every direction was equally wild, equally unknown, equally yours. The horizons stretched forever in every direction, unbroken by buildings or walls or fences. When you stood on a hill and looked out, you saw only what nature had made. Forests so thick you couldn't see through them. Plains that went on until they blurred into sky. Mountains that no human had ever climbed or even named. Rivers that flowed without bridges, without boats, just water doing what water does, carving its path through stone and soil over millions of years. The silence must have been incredible. Not total silence, never that. Nature is never truly silent. But the silence of human noise. No engines, no construction, no voices echoing through city streets. Just wind through grass. Birds calling. The rustle of an animal moving through underbrush. Water flowing over rocks. Thunder rolling across empty plains. The crack of a tree branch breaking under its own weight. At night, when darkness came, it came completely. No streetlights, no glow from distant cities. The only light came from the moon and stars, and on a clear night, away from any fire, the Milky Way would blaze across the sky, so bright you could almost read by it. Stars so numerous they seemed to touch each other, a river of light flowing overhead. People saw the same constellations we see now, but they saw them without any light pollution, without any barrier between them and the infinite. The night sky wasn't just beautiful. It was overwhelming, humbling, a reminder of how small you were and how vast everything else was. And here's something we forget. The world was bigger then, not physically, but practically. A journey of 100 miles might take weeks, might take you through terrain no human had ever crossed before. There were no maps because nothing was fixed, nothing was named, nothing was claimed. Every journey was an exploration. Every hill might hide something new. Every valley might be empty or might hold a group of strangers who could be friends or enemies. The world was full of mystery because humans hadn't yet mapped it, hadn't yet convinced themselves they understood it. Let's talk about the animals. This is where it gets wild, literally. The world before civilization was a world where humans were not the dominant species. Not even close. We were clever, yes. We had fire, we had tools, we had language. But we were also prey. We were food for things bigger and stronger and faster than us. Imagine walking through a landscape where at any moment a cave lion might be watching you from the shadows. These weren't the lions we know today. Cave lions were massive, bigger than modern lions, built for hunting large prey, and humans definitely qualified as large prey. They hunted in prides, they were intelligent, and they had been perfecting their hunting skills for millions of years, longer than humans had been perfecting their survival skills, or saber-toothed cats, Smilodon. Those enormous fangs weren't just for show. They were precision instruments designed to pierce through thick hide and muscle, to deliver killing blows to animals that weighed tons. A human was an easy target by comparison. Soft skin, no armor, relatively slow, no natural weapons beyond our brains and our tools. And those tools were crude. Sharp rocks, wooden spears, maybe fire if you were lucky. That was it. That's what you had to defend yourself against predators that evolution had spent millions of years perfecting. There were giant bears. Short-faced bears in the Americas that stood 12 feet tall on their hind legs, that could run faster than a horse, that ate anything they could catch, including humans. There were dire wolves, larger and more powerful than modern wolves, hunting in packs, coordinated and relentless. In Europe and Asia there were hyenas, not the scavengers we think of today, but active predators, capable of taking down prey much larger than themselves. But it wasn't just the predators. The herbivores were just as dangerous, maybe more so because they were everywhere. Mammoths roamed across continents in massive herds. These weren't gentle giants. They were unpredictable, temperamental, and if you startled one or threatened its young, it could crush you without even noticing. A mammoth weighed as much as 10 or 12 people, covered in thick fur and hide that could shrug off most weapons. Its tusks could gore you, its feet could stomp you flat, and it had the intelligence to know when it was threatened. There were mastodons, slightly smaller but just as dangerous. Giant ground sloths that could rear up and disembowel you with their claws. Woolly rhinoceros with horns that could impale anything foolish enough to get close. Herds of giant bison that could trample you if you spooked them. Every animal was a potential threat because you weren't at the top of the food chain. You were somewhere in the middle trying to survive, trying not to become someone else's dinner. So humans learned to be careful. They learned to watch, to listen, to read the signs that told them when danger was near. They learned which animals were active during which times of day. They learned migration patterns, hunting territories, the sounds that meant run and the sounds that meant hide. They developed a kind of awareness that most of us today have completely lost, an ability to read the landscape, to notice the details that meant the difference between life and death. A bent blade of grass might tell you something heavy passed through recently. The behavior of birds might tell you a predator was nearby. The wind direction mattered because it carried your scent, and if you were downwind of a predator, you were in trouble. Every sense was tuned to survival. Your ears learned to filter out the normal sounds and focus on the abnormal ones. Your eyes learned to spot movement in the periphery, to detect shapes that didn't belong. Your sense of smell became more acute because smoke meant fire, and fire might mean other humans, and other humans might mean danger or help depending on who they were. And here's what's fascinating. Despite all this danger, despite living in a world filled with creatures that could kill them, humans spread across almost the entire planet. From Africa, they moved into Europe, into Asia, across the land bridge, into the Americas, eventually even into Australia and the Pacific Islands. They adapted to deserts, to jungles, to frozen tundra, to mountains, to coastlines. They learned to survive everywhere, not by being stronger or faster than the animals around them, but by being smarter, more adaptable, more cooperative. Let's pause here and think about what this means. The world before civilization wasn't a paradise, but it wasn't a hellscape either. It was simply wild, raw, unfiltered nature operating according to its own rules. And humans found a way to fit into that world, to carve out a niche, to not just survive, but to spread and thrive. They did this without agriculture, without cities, without any of the technology we consider essential today. They did it with fire, with stone tools, with their brains and their ability to work together. That's not primitive. That's extraordinary. Life before civilization moved according to rhythms we've mostly forgotten. Not the rhythm of clocks or calendars, but the rhythm of seasons, of animal migrations, of fruiting trees and spawning fish. Everything followed patterns, and survival meant learning those patterns, memorizing them, passing them down through generations, not in books, but in stories, in songs, in demonstrations from parent to child. When the world was wild, time itself felt different. There was no rush, no schedule, no appointments to keep. But there was also no safety net, no grocery store to visit when food ran low, no hospital when someone got sick, no police to call when danger appeared. Every day required attention, awareness, participation. You couldn't coast through life. Life demanded everything from you. And in return, it gave you everything you needed if you were smart enough, skilled enough, and lucky enough to take it. The year revolved around food. In spring, certain plants would flower, certain animals would give birth, certain fish would swim upstream to spawn. This was a time of abundance, a time to gather and hunt and build up reserves for harder times ahead. People would move to rivers to catch salmon, or to forests where deer were calving, or to meadows where roots and bulbs were pushing up through the soil. Summer brought different opportunities. Berries ripened, nuts formed on trees. Larger game could be hunted when they were fat and healthy. This was the time to prepare, to smoke meat, to dry berries, to gather medicinal plants before they withered. The days were long, and you used every hour of light because you knew what was coming. Fall meant harvest time, even before anyone farmed. Fruits hung heavy on trees, nuts littered the ground, animals fattened themselves for winter and became prime targets for hunting. This was the last chance to gather everything you'd need to survive the cold months. Roots were dug up, stored in cool places. Fish were caught and dried. Every edible thing was collected because winter was unforgiving. Winter was survival. In colder climates, it meant staying close to shelter, rationing food, keeping fires burning constantly. The world became smaller, more intimate. You spent more time with your group, telling stories, making tools, teaching children the skills they'd need to survive. In warmer climates, winter was less harsh, but still required adaptation. Patterns changed, animals migrated, plants went dormant, and you had to know where to find food when your usual sources disappeared. This cycle repeated every year, and every year people had to be ready. There was no margin for error. If you didn't gather enough food in the abundant seasons, you'd starve in the lean ones. If you didn't repair your tools and weapons when you had time, they'd fail you when you needed them most. If you didn't teach your children the patterns, they'd die young, unable to survive without the knowledge passed down through countless generations. But here's what we miss when we think about this life. It wasn't all struggle, there was rhythm to it, a kind of peace that comes from living in sync with the world around you. You weren't fighting against nature, trying to control it, trying to bend it to your will. You were part of it, moving with it, adapting to it. When food was abundant, you celebrated. When times were hard, you endured together. There was a simplicity to it that we've lost, a clarity of purpose. Your goals were immediate and obvious. Find food, stay warm, stay safe, raise your children, help your group. Everything else was secondary. There was no existential crisis about your purpose in life because your purpose was survival. And survival was a full-time job that required every skill you had. The day started at dawn because there was no reason to waste daylight. You might check snares or traps you'd set the night before, looking for rabbits or birds that had gotten caught. You might gather water from a nearby stream, always watching for signs of predators, always aware that watering holes attracted everything, including danger. Breakfast might be leftover meat from the night before, or nuts and berries, or nothing at all if supplies were low. Then the work began. Maybe today was a hunting day. The men, and sometimes the women, would set out, tracking game, moving silently through the landscape, communicating with hand signals and subtle sounds. Hunting wasn't like it is in movies. It wasn't exciting or glorious. It was slow, patient, exhausting work. You might track an animal for hours, for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. You might fail completely, come home empty-handed, hungry and tired and frustrated. Or you might succeed, bring down a deer or a wild boar, and then the real work began. Butchering, carrying the meat back to camp, preparing it, sharing it with the group. Every successful hunt meant food for days, maybe weeks if you preserved it properly. Or maybe today was a gathering day. The women and children would spread out looking for plants, roots, mushrooms, insects, eggs, anything edible. This was actually where most calories came from in pre-civilization life. Hunting was important, but it was unreliable. Plants were everywhere, and if you knew what to look for, you could always find something to eat. The gatherers learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous, which roots could be eaten raw and which needed to be cooked, which berries were ripe and which would make you sick. This knowledge was passed down carefully because mistakes were fatal. One wrong mushroom could kill you or make you so sick you wished you were dead. So children learned by watching, by listening, by practicing under supervision until they knew the difference between dozens or hundreds of plant species, by sight, by smell, by taste. And then there was tool making. Stone tools don't just appear. Creating a good stone blade required skill, patience, knowledge of different types of rock and how they fractured. You'd find the right kind of stone, usually flint or obsidian or something similar, and you'd work it carefully, striking it with another stone at precise angles, flaking off pieces, slowly shaping it into the form you needed. A knife, a spear point, a scraper, an awl. Each tool had a purpose, each required different techniques, and a skilled toolmaker was valuable to any group. Weapons needed to be maintained, sharpened, replaced when they broke. Spear shafts needed to be straight and strong. Hafting a stone point to a shaft required knowledge of adhesives, usually plant resins combined with sinew or plant fibers, and it had to be done right, or your spear would fall apart at the worst possible moment, right when you needed it to bring down dinner or defend yourself from a threat. There was hide working. Any animal you killed provided not just meat, but materials. The hide could be cleaned, scraped, softened, and turned into clothing, bags, shelters. This was skilled work, time-consuming and necessary. In cold climates, good clothing meant the difference between life and death. You needed to know how to tan leather, how to sew skins together using bone needles and sinew thread, how to waterproof them with fat, how to repair them when they wore out. There was fire management. Fire wasn't something you could just turn on and off. Starting a fire from scratch was difficult, required the right materials and techniques, and in wet weather, it was nearly impossible. So once you had a fire going, you kept it going. Someone was always responsible for the fire, feeding it, making sure it didn't go out, making sure it didn't spread and burn everything down. Fire meant warmth, protection from predators, the ability to cook food and make it safer to eat. Losing your fire could be a death sentence, especially in winter. By midday, the group might gather together if hunting or gathering had been successful. Food would be shared, usually according to rules that had been established over generations. The hunter might get first choice, but everyone got something. Sharing wasn't just generosity, it was survival strategy. Today, you made the kill. Tomorrow, someone else would. And you'd all help each other through the times when nobody was successful. This reciprocity was the foundation of human society, the thing that allowed us to survive when individual strength or skill wasn't enough. The afternoon might be spent on other tasks, making baskets to carry things, preparing plant fibers for rope, collecting firewood, repairing shelters, teaching children, always teaching. Children learned by doing, by watching adults work and imitating them, by playing games that taught hunting skills, or plant identification or tool use. Education wasn't separate from life. It was woven into every moment, every activity. You learned because you had to, because your life would depend on these skills, and you absorbed knowledge the way you absorbed language, naturally, inevitably, because you were surrounded by it. Evening brought the group back together around the fire. This was when stories were told, when the day's events were discussed, when knowledge was shared. Someone might describe where they'd seen animal tracks, what the herd animals were doing, which plants were ready to harvest. Elders might tell stories about past hunts, about times of hardship and how the group survived, about the landscape and its hidden resources. These stories weren't entertainment, though they were entertaining. They were education, history, navigation guides, survival manuals, all woven into narratives that made them memorable. A story about an ancestor who found water during a drought would teach you where water sources were hidden. A story about a hunter who escaped from a cave lion would teach you how cave lions hunted and how to avoid them. A story about a plant that saved someone from starvation would teach you what that plant looked like and where to find it. Night came early without artificial light, and when darkness fell, people slept. Not all at once, not everyone at the same time. Someone always kept watch, feeding the fire, listening for sounds that didn't belong, alert for danger. Predators hunted at night, and humans were vulnerable then, easy targets if they weren't careful. So you slept lightly, part of your brain always listening, always ready to wake at the first sign of trouble. And you slept close together, huddled for warmth and safety, families and groups all intertwined. No privacy the way we think of it today, but also no loneliness, no isolation. You were always part of something larger than yourself, always connected, always held within the web of relationships that made up your world. This was life, day after day, season after season, year after year. It was hard, yes, dangerous, absolutely, but it was also rich in ways we've lost. Every day brought new challenges, new discoveries, new reasons to pay attention. You couldn't zone out, couldn't go through the motions. Life demanded your full presence, and in giving it, you became more alive than most people today ever feel. You knew your landscape intimately, every plant, every animal, every stream and hill and cave. You knew your people completely, their strengths and weaknesses, their moods and needs. You knew yourself, your limits, your capabilities, what you could endure and what would break you. This knowledge wasn't intellectual. It was visceral, bone deep, earned through experience and survival. Let's talk about the humans themselves. Who were these people? What were they like? We tend to think of prehistoric humans as brutish, primitive, somehow less than us. That's completely wrong. They had the same brains we have, the same capacity for intelligence, creativity, emotion, and complex thought. The only difference was their knowledge base, their technology, their culture. But the hardware was identical. If you could somehow take a baby from 60,000 years ago and raise them in the modern world, they'd be indistinguishable from any other child. They'd learn to read and write, use computers, go to college, have the same hopes and dreams and frustrations as anyone else. The reverse is also true. If you took a modern baby and raised them in a hunter-gatherer group, they'd learn to track animals, identify plants, make tools, and survive in the wild, just as well as anyone born in that time. We're the same species, separated only by time and circumstance. These people lived in small groups, usually extended families or clans of 20 to 50 individuals. Sometimes groups would come together temporarily, forming larger gatherings of 100 or more people, especially in seasons when food was abundant and could support larger populations. These gatherings were important. They were times for trading, for finding mates outside your immediate group, for sharing knowledge and news, for celebrating, for resolving conflicts between groups, for making alliances. But most of the time you lived with your small group, the same faces day after day, people you'd known your entire life, people you trusted completely because you had to. Your survival depended on them, and theirs depended on you. This created bonds deeper than most modern relationships. When your life literally depends on the person next to you watching your back, trusting them not to abandon you when danger comes, sharing food with you when supplies are low, you develop a connection that goes beyond friendship or even family. It's primal, essential, woven into the fabric of who you are. Leadership in these groups wasn't like leadership in civilization. There were no kings, no permanent rulers, no one with absolute power. Instead, leadership was fluid, based on skill and situation. The best hunter might lead a hunting party, but when it came to gathering plants, someone else with more knowledge would take charge. The oldest members of the group, the elders, were respected for their experience and wisdom, but they didn't give orders. They advised, they taught, they shared what they'd learned over a lifetime. Decision-making was collective. When the group needed to move to a new location, when there was a conflict to resolve, when resources needed to be divided, everyone had a say. Not because they believed in democracy as an ideal, but because cooperation required consensus. If you tried to dominate the group, they'd either kick you out or leave you behind. Social cohesion mattered more than individual power. Conflict did happen, of course. Humans are humans, and we've always had disagreements, jealousies, anger. But in small groups where everyone depends on everyone else, you can't let conflicts fester. They had to be resolved, usually through discussion, sometimes through ritual combat or contests that allowed people to blow off steam without actually hurting each other seriously. Murder did occur, but it was rare because the consequences were severe. If you killed someone in your own group, you'd likely be exiled, sent away to survive on your own, which was often a death sentence. If you killed someone from another group, it might spark a blood feud that could last generations. So violence was discouraged, controlled, channeled into acceptable forms. People learned to manage their anger, to talk through their problems, to find solutions that kept the group intact, because the alternative was unthinkable. Women and men had different roles, but those roles were more flexible and equal than in later civilizations. Women gathered, men hunted, but these weren't absolute divisions. Women who were good hunters could join hunting parties. Men who were skilled at gathering did that work. The crucial thing was that both roles were essential. Gathering provided most of the calories, the steady food supply that kept people alive day to day. Hunting provided protein, fat, materials, and excitement, but it was unreliable. A group couldn't survive on hunting alone. So women's work was valued, recognized as necessary, and women had voices in group decisions because their knowledge and skills were too important to ignore. Children were raised communally. Yes, you knew who your mother was, and your mother had a special bond with you, but everyone in the group helped raise everyone's children. Other women nursed infants if the mother was sick or died. Men taught children to make tools and hunt. Elders taught stories and knowledge. Children played with all the other children, learned from all the adults, were corrected and praised and cared for by the entire community. This had advantages. If your parent died, you weren't orphaned, not really. You still had a dozen other adults who cared about you, who would feed you and protect you and teach you. The group absorbed the loss and moved forward. People formed relationships, fell in love, chose partners. Pair bonding was common, but it wasn't always permanent or exclusive in the way we think of marriage today. Some groups were monogamous, some weren't. The important thing was that children were cared for and that adults cooperated. Sexual relationships were part of life, regulated by social rules that varied from group to group but always existed to prevent conflict and ensure that children had support. Jealousy existed, attraction existed, but they were managed within the context of group harmony. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted because your actions affected everyone, and the group's survival came first. Death was part of life in a way that's hard for us to comprehend. People died young by our standards. Average lifespan was probably 30 to 40 years, though if you survived childhood and avoided accidents and predators, you could live to 60 or even older. But infant mortality was high. Many children died before their first birthday. Women often died in childbirth. Men died from hunting accidents or predator attacks or infections from wounds. Everyone died from diseases we'd consider minor today. A bad infection, a serious injury, a difficult birth. And you died because there was no advanced medicine, no antibiotics, no surgery. So people learned to cope with death, to accept it as inevitable, to mourn and then move on because survival required it. The dead were buried or left for scavengers depending on the group's beliefs, but they were remembered. Stories kept their memory alive, and the knowledge they'd accumulated was passed down to the next generation. And yet, despite all this hardship, despite the danger and the death and the constant struggle, people found joy. They laughed, they played, they created art. We've found cave paintings from this period, beautiful, detailed images of animals and hunts and mysterious symbols we don't fully understand. Someone took the time to make these, to mix pigments from minerals and plants, to climb deep into caves and paint by firelight on stone walls. Why? Not for survival, not for anything practical. For beauty, for meaning, for the sheer human need to create something lasting. They carved figurines from bone and stone, tiny sculptures of animals and humans. They made jewelry from shells and teeth and beads, decorating themselves even when resources were scarce. They played music on flutes carved from bone, on drums made from hide stretched over wood. They told stories, sang songs, danced around fires under the stars. This is what we forget. These weren't grim, joyless people just trying not to die. They were fully human, with the same range of emotions we have. They loved their children, mourned their dead, celebrated their victories, found beauty in their world. They were curious, creative, playful, thoughtful. They wondered about the stars, about where the sun went at night, about what happened after death. They developed belief systems, spiritual practices, rituals that gave meaning to their lives. They buried their dead with care, sometimes with grave goods, suggesting they believed in some kind of afterlife. They painted themselves with ochre, a red pigment that showed up in burials across the world, suggesting it had spiritual significance. They were, in every way that matters, us. Just living in a different world with different challenges, different knowledge, but the same essential human nature. The world before civilization wasn't static. It changed dramatically, and humans had to adapt or die. During much of this period, the Earth was in an ice age, not completely frozen, but with massive ice sheets covering large parts of Europe, Asia, and North America. Glaciers miles-thick ground across the landscape, carving valleys, scraping away soil, creating the terrain we see today. Sea levels were lower because so much water was locked up in ice, and this created land bridges that don't exist anymore. You could walk from Asia to North America across what's now the Bering Strait. You could walk from mainland Asia to many Pacific islands. Britain was connected to Europe. The world's coastlines were completely different, and many of the places where humans lived then are now underwater, their archaeological sites lost forever beneath the waves. Living during an ice age meant adapting to cold. In northern regions, winter lasted most of the year. Summers were brief, cool, barely enough time for plants to grow, and animals to reproduce before the cold returned. This shaped everything about how people lived. They needed warm clothing, shelters that could withstand harsh weather, ways to find food when everything was frozen or dead. They learned to hunt the animals that thrived in the cold, mammoths and reindeer and muskoxen. They learned to fish through ice, to find roots and tubers buried beneath snow, to preserve food for the long months when nothing grew. They became experts at survival in conditions that would kill most modern people within hours. But the Ice Age wasn't uniformly cold everywhere. Near the equator, the climate was more moderate, though still cooler and drier than today. Tropical forests were smaller, grasslands were larger, and different patterns of animal migration meant different hunting strategies. In some regions, the climate was actually quite pleasant, abundant with food and water, allowing populations to grow and develop more complex social structures. This is important because it means different groups of humans were living in radically different conditions, developing different skills, different cultures, different solutions to the problem of survival. A group living near the ice sheets would have almost nothing in common with a group living near the equator, except that they were all human and all solving the fundamental problem of how to stay alive in whatever environment they found themselves. Then, around 15,000 years ago, everything changed. The ice began to retreat. Slowly at first, then faster, the glaciers melted, sea levels rose, and the world transformed. This wasn't a gentle, gradual warming. The climate swung wildly, periods of warmth followed by sudden return to cold, then warming again. These changes happened over centuries and millennia, fast in geological terms, but slow enough that humans could adapt. They followed the retreating ice, moving into new territories that had been locked under glaciers for thousands of years. They hunted the animals that also moved north, exploiting new resources, Discovering new lands. The melting ice created massive floods as glacial lakes burst their dams, rivers carved new channels, and coastlines shifted. Stories of great floods appear in many cultures, and some researchers think these might be distorted memories of real events, of times when rising seas swallowed coastal settlements, when massive floods displaced entire populations. As the world warmed, forests grew where grasslands had been. Animal populations shifted. Some species that had thrived during the Ice Age began to disappear, hunted to extinction by humans or unable to adapt to the changing climate or both. The megafauna, the giant mammals that had dominated the landscape, started dying out. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave lions, all began their slow march toward extinction. This happened over thousands of years, and humans played a role, but it wasn't simply overhunting. The climate was changing, habitats were disappearing, and these large animals needed vast territories and specific conditions to survive. As their world shrank, they died out, and with them went a whole ecosystem that had existed for millions of years. Humans had to adapt again. The animals they'd relied on for food were disappearing. The landscapes they knew were transforming. But humans are nothing if not adaptable. They shifted their hunting strategies to target smaller, faster animals. They gathered more intensively, learning to exploit every possible food source. They moved more frequently, exploring new territories, spreading into regions that had been uninhabitable during the Ice Age. They reached Australia, crossing open ocean in boats we can only guess at, settling a continent that had been isolated for millions of years. They reached the Americas, spreading from north to south with remarkable speed, discovering landscapes filled with animals that had never seen humans before and didn't know to fear them. Within a few thousand years, humans had reached almost every habitable part of the planet, from the Arctic to the Amazon, from deserts to rainforests to high mountains. This expansion happened before agriculture, before cities, before anything we'd call civilization. It was just humans being humans, exploring, adapting, surviving, thriving wherever they went. But the warming also created new opportunities. With warmer, wetter climates came more plant growth, more diversity of species, more predictable seasons. In certain regions, wild plants grew so abundantly that people could settle in one place for longer periods, harvesting what grew naturally rather than constantly moving to find food. This was the beginning of something new, though nobody at the time could have known it. In the Fertile Crescent in what's now the Middle East, wild grains grew thick in river valleys. People harvested them, learned their growing cycles, began to understand how seeds worked. They weren't farming yet, not deliberately planting and tending crops, but they were noticing patterns, learning the relationship between seeds and plants. In other regions, similar processes were happening independently. People noticed that wild plants grew back where they'd been harvested. They noticed that plants grew better in certain soils, that clearing away competing vegetation helped desired plants thrive. These observations accumulated over generations, passed down as knowledge, setting the stage for what would come next. Animals, too, were changing their relationship with humans. Some animals, particularly wolves, began to hang around human camps, feeding on scraps, providing warning of approaching dangers with their barks. Over many generations, the wolves that were less aggressive, more tolerant of humans, more useful, survived and reproduced slowly, almost accidentally, becoming dogs. This wasn't deliberate breeding at first. It was just natural selection operating in a new environment where being friendly to humans conferred advantages. The same process would later occur with other animals: goats, sheep, pigs, cattle, but that's getting ahead of the story. For now, in this world before civilization, the relationship was just beginning. A partnership between species that would reshape both. Here's something fascinating. Even though there were no nations, no borders, no maps, the world before civilization wasn't a free-for-all where everyone went everywhere. There were territories, understood boundaries, regions that belonged to particular groups. These weren't marked with signs or fences, but everyone knew them. You knew where your group's territory ended and another group's began. You knew which resources were yours to exploit and which belonged to others. These boundaries were maintained through a complex system of relationships, agreements, and occasionally, violence. Groups defended their territories because those territories meant survival. If your best hunting grounds were taken, if your water sources were claimed by others, you'd be in trouble. So boundaries mattered, were respected most of the time, and enforced when necessary. But these territories weren't static. They shifted with the seasons as groups moved to follow animal migrations or to harvest seasonal plants. They shifted over generations as populations grew or shrank, as climate changed, as resources appeared or disappeared. And they were permeable. Members of different groups met, traded, shared information, sometimes merged together, sometimes split apart. Women often moved between groups when they took partners, creating kinship ties that connected distant communities. These networks of relationships created a web of connections across vast distances, so news could travel, ideas could spread, innovations could be shared. A new type of tool invented in one region might appear in another region hundreds of miles away within a few generations, carried by traders or spreading through these social networks. Trade existed long before markets or money. People traded things they had in abundance for things they needed. Coastal groups traded shells and fish, and salt for animal hides, and ochre from inland groups. Groups near sources of good toolstone traded that for food or clothing or other resources. Obsidian, a volcanic glass that makes excellent cutting tools, has been found hundreds of miles from its source, carried through multiple trades, passing from hand to hand, each time increasing in value because of its rarity and utility. These trade networks were ancient, extending back tens of thousands of years, connecting groups that never met directly but were linked through intermediaries. This meant that ideas traveled too. A new hunting technique, a better way to process hides, knowledge of a medicinal plant, all could spread across continents over time, improving survival for everyone. Language was probably the most important tool humans had, more important than fire, more important than any stone blade. Language allowed knowledge to be shared precisely, experiences to be communicated, plans to be made. It allowed teaching to be detailed and effective. It allowed stories to carry information across generations. And language was diverse. Every group spoke its own dialect or language, distinct from its neighbors, and over distances the differences accumulated until languages were mutually unintelligible. This linguistic diversity reflected the isolation of groups, the long periods spent without contact with outsiders. But it also reflected human creativity, the constant evolution of language, as new words were needed for new concepts, as sounds shifted, as generations added their own innovations. We'll never know what these languages sounded like. They left no written records, but we can be sure they were complex, sophisticated, fully capable of expressing any thought or idea that we express today. And here's something we often miss. These people weren't ignorant or superstitious in the way we sometimes assume. They had deep, accurate knowledge of their environment, knowledge that took generations to accumulate and was passed down carefully. They understood animal behavior in detail, could predict migrations, knew breeding cycles, recognized individual animals by their tracks. They understood plant biology, knew which plants grew in which soils, which needed sun or shade, which needed fire to germinate. They understood weather patterns, could read clouds and winds, knew when storms were coming, when seasons would change. This knowledge was empirical, based on careful observation over thousands of years, refined and tested constantly. It wasn't scientific in our sense. They didn't do experiments or write papers, but it was science in the fundamental sense of observing nature and drawing conclusions that could be tested against reality. Their spiritual beliefs, their myths and stories served multiple purposes. Yes, they were about meaning and morality and explaining things they couldn't understand, but they were also knowledge encoded in narrative form. A story about a spirit that lived in a particular valley might really be a warning that that valley was dangerous, prone to floods or rock slides. A story about ancestors who performed a particular ritual before a hunt might really be a mnemonic device for remembering the steps of a successful hunting strategy. A story about a sacred plant might preserve knowledge of that plant's medicinal properties. We modern people tend to separate practical knowledge from spiritual belief, but for them, it was all woven together, all part of a unified understanding of how the world worked. The stories weren't lies or primitive explanations. They were how you remembered and transmitted complex information in a world without writing. Sacred places existed, caves with paintings, particular mountains or rivers or forests that held spiritual significance, burial grounds that were respected across generations. These places were important for group identity, for maintaining connections with ancestors, for marking the landscape with human meaning. They were also often practical. A sacred cave might also be a shelter during storms. A sacred mountain might be a landmark for navigation. A sacred river was also a reliable water source. The spiritual and practical were intertwined, each reinforcing the other, creating a relationship with the landscape that was both utilitarian and deeply emotional. Modern people visit places that are special to them, places from their childhood or where important events happened, and feel a connection. Prehistoric people felt the same about their landscape, but stronger, deeper, because their entire lives played out in those places, and those places held the accumulated meaning of countless generations. Everything we've described so far, this wild, nomadic, hunter-gatherer life, worked. It worked for hundreds of thousands of years. It was sustainable in balance with the environment, not destructive or extractive. Populations remained small. Resource use remained within what nature could replenish. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. This wasn't sudden. There was no moment when someone invented civilization. Instead, over thousands of years, in different places around the world, people started doing things slightly differently, and those small changes accumulated until the world was transformed. Let's talk about what was happening in the final millennia before what we call civilization emerged. The world was warming, stabilizing after the end of the Ice Age. In certain regions, particularly in the Middle East, climate and geography created unusual conditions. Wild grains, wheat and barley grew abundantly in river valleys. Wild legumes provided protein. Fruit and nut trees were common. Game was plentiful. These areas were what archaeologists call resource-rich environments, places where food was so abundant that people could settle down, at least part of the year, rather than constantly moving. Around 12,000 years ago in the Levant, people began building permanent structures, not just temporary shelters, but houses made of stone and mud brick, houses that required effort to build and implied intention to stay. These weren't cities, not even close. They were small villages of a few dozen people at most, but they represented a shift. People were choosing to stay in one place, to invest labor in permanent structures, to commit to a particular location rather than remaining mobile. Why? Partly because the resources were so abundant it made sense. Partly because building houses allowed you to store food more effectively, to accumulate surpluses, to weather bad years by having reserves. And partly, maybe because staying in one place allowed different kinds of social relationships, more complex group structures, more investment in community. These early villages showed the first signs of social differentiation. Most dwellings were similar, but some were larger, better built, filled with more goods. Some individuals were buried with more care, with more grave goods, suggesting they had higher status. This wasn't yet the extreme inequality of later civilizations, but it was the beginning. As people accumulated possessions, as some became better at certain skills, as resources became more concentrated, differences in wealth and power began to emerge. Leadership became more formalized. Probably certain families became prominent, held authority across generations, started to think of themselves as different from, better than, others. This would have been gradual, resisted by egalitarian traditions, but it happened nonetheless. And people were experimenting with plants. They were still gathering wild grains, but they were also noticing patterns. Seeds that fell in cleared ground grew better. Seeds that fell in disturbed soil near settlements grew better. Slowly, probably over many generations, people began to actively plant seeds, to clear ground deliberately, to protect growing plants from animals and weeds. This wasn't farming as we know it. Not yet. It was something in between called cultivation. People were influencing plant growth without fully controlling it, helping desired plants along, shifting from simply harvesting what nature provided to actively shaping what grew. The plants were changing too. Wild wheat has seeds that shatter and scatter when ripe, which makes harvesting difficult. But occasionally, a mutation would produce wheat with seeds that stayed on the stalk, much easier to harvest. People would save those seeds, plant them the next year, and gradually, over many generations, without realizing what they were doing, they were selectively breeding wheat to be more useful to humans. The same process was happening with other plants. Larger seeds, less bitter flavors, easier to harvest or process. The plants were becoming domesticated, adapted to human use, dependent on humans for propagation. And at the same time, in different parts of the world, similar processes were happening independently. In China, people were beginning to cultivate rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, people were beginning to cultivate maize, beans, and squash. In Africa, people were beginning to cultivate sorghum and yams. In each region, the specific plants were different, adapted to local conditions, but the process was the same. People were shifting from hunting and gathering to cultivation and herding, slowly, tentatively, probably without understanding the long-term implications. This shift wasn't inevitable. Many groups never made it, continued hunting and gathering successfully for thousands more years, in some cases right up to the present day. The shift only made sense in certain environments where the right plants and animals existed, where the climate was suitable, where resources allowed for settled life. But where it did happen, it changed everything. Farming, once it developed, produced more food per unit of land than hunting and gathering. This meant larger populations could be supported in the same space. This meant population growth, which meant more mouths to feed, which meant more incentive to farm more intensively, which supported even larger populations. A feedback loop had begun that would accelerate over the coming millennia. But we're still before civilization here. These early farmers weren't building cities or writing or developing complex politics. They were living in small villages, growing some of their food while still hunting and gathering to supplement their diet. Life was still hard, probably harder in some ways than before. Farming is labor-intensive. You have to clear land, plant seeds, weed, protect crops from pests and animals, harvest, process, store. It's more work than hunting and gathering, and it's more boring, more repetitive. And it made people less healthy. Skeletons from early farming communities show more signs of malnutrition, more dental problems, more diseases than skeletons from hunter-gatherer populations. Relying on a few staple crops meant less dietary diversity, more vulnerability to crop failure, more disease as populations increased and people lived in close proximity. Farming also tied people to land, made them vulnerable to raiders who could steal their harvest, forced them to defend territory more aggressively. So why did people do it? Partly because once you started, you couldn't easily go back. If your population had grown to the point where hunting and gathering couldn't support it, you had to keep farming. Partly because farming allowed accumulation of wealth, and some people benefited from that. Leaders, warriors, skilled craftspeople who could specialize because farmers were producing surplus food. And partly because farming allowed new kinds of social complexity, new forms of organization and identity that some people found appealing. But this was still a gradual process. For thousands of years after farming began, many people were part-time farmers, supplementing cultivation with hunting and gathering, maintaining a mixed economy that gave them flexibility. Villages remained small, political organization remained simple. There were no kings or armies or temples. That would come later as farming intensified, as populations grew, as surpluses accumulated and had to be managed and protected and fought over. We're still in the twilight of the pre-civilization world, the final centuries before the first cities arose, before writing was invented, before history in the traditional sense began. The people living in these transitional times couldn't know what was coming. They couldn't see that their experiments with planting seeds and settling in villages would lead to cities and states and empires. They were just trying to survive, trying to improve their lives in small, incremental ways. The farmer planting barley seeds in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago wasn't thinking about civilization. He was thinking about having enough food for his family, about whether the rains would come, about protecting his crop from birds and rodents. The woman in ancient China cultivating rice in a river valley wasn't imagining the dynasties that would one day rule that land. She was thinking about her children, about the work that needed to be done today, about the patterns of the season. These were people like us, focused on immediate concerns, unable to see the long-term consequences of their actions. And here's what's important. The world before civilization wasn't a primitive prelude to something better. It was a fully realized way of life, successful on its own terms, that lasted longer than civilization has existed. From the time anatomically modern humans appeared, roughly 300,000 years ago, to the rise of the first cities about 5,000 years ago. That's 295,000 years of pre-civilization life. 295,000 years of humans living successfully without agriculture, without writing, without political states. Civilization, this thing we think of as the natural state of humanity, has only existed for 5,000 years. It's less than 2% of our species' history. We've been civilized for the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. Most of our evolution, most of our adaptation happened in that pre-civilization world. Our bodies, our brains, our instincts, all developed in a world of small groups and constant movement and immediate connection with nature. We're adapted for that world, not for the world we've created. This is why so many of us feel disconnected, anxious, stressed in modern life. We're animals designed for one kind of existence, living in a completely different one. Our bodies want to move constantly, not sit at desks. Our brains are designed to focus on immediate, concrete problems, not abstract concepts. Our social instincts are calibrated for groups of a few dozen people, not cities of millions. Our circadian rhythms evolved under natural light, not artificial illumination. We're fish out of water, trying to adapt to an environment we created but that we're not fully suited for. The people before civilization didn't have our problems because they were living the way humans evolved to live. They had different problems, sure, but those were problems we're equipped to handle. Stress from predators triggers acute fight-or-flight responses that were useful then. Stress from deadlines and traffic and social media triggers the same responses, but they're useless in those contexts. They just wear us down without serving any protective function. What did we lose when civilization emerged? We lost mobility, the freedom to move wherever we wanted. We lost egalitarianism, the rough equality of hunter-gatherer groups where everyone's contribution mattered. We lost immediate connection with nature, understanding of plants and animals, and weather that was once common knowledge. We lost community cohesion, the deep bonds formed when your survival depends on the people around you. We lost physical health, the strength and fitness that came from constant activity. We lost dietary diversity, the varied nutrition of hundreds of different food sources replaced by dependence on a few crops. We lost leisure time. Hunter-gatherers, despite popular belief, worked less than farmers, less than modern people. Studies of remaining hunter-gatherer groups show they spend about 15 to 20 hours per week on subsistence activities. The rest is leisure, spent socializing, playing, resting, creating art. Farmers worked much more, and modern people work more still, despite all our labor-saving technology. But we also gained things. We gained the ability to support larger populations. We gained specialization, allowing some people to become skilled craftspeople or thinkers or artists, without having to spend all their time on food production. We gained the ability to accumulate knowledge and pass it down in written form, building on previous generations' discoveries. We gained medicine, reducing child mortality, extending lifespans. We gained technology, creating tools and machines that can accomplish things impossible for human muscle alone. We gained art and literature and music of types that couldn't exist in pre-literate societies. We gained the ability to explore and understand the universe, to leave the planet, to manipulate matter at the atomic level. Whether these gains outweigh the losses is a question everyone has to answer for themselves. But it's worth acknowledging that both exist, that civilization brought incredible benefits and also real costs. The world before civilization was neither paradise nor hell. It was simply different, a world where humans lived as part of nature rather than trying to control it, where communities were small and intimate, where life was physically demanding but socially rich, where knowledge was embodied and experiential rather than abstract and textual. It was a world that worked, that sustained our species for the vast majority of our existence, that shaped us into what we are. Understanding that world helps us understand ourselves, helps us recognize which of our impulses are adaptive and which are anachronistic, helps us see what we might be missing in our modern lives. Even now, living in the modern world with all its complexity and technology, we carry the world before civilization inside us. It's there in our instincts, our preferences, our deep-seated feelings that don't always make rational sense in contemporary context. Think about why people love camping, hiking, being in nature. It's not just aesthetic appreciation. It's something deeper, a recognition at some level that this is where we belong, this is the environment we evolved in. Think about why social isolation is so painful, why loneliness is such a profound form of suffering. It's because for most of human history, being alone meant death. We're social animals to our core, wired to need connection with others. And when that need isn't met, our brains interpret it as an emergency, something to be fixed immediately. Think about why we crave fatty, sweet, salty foods, even though they're bad for us in excess. It's because for most of human history, those foods were rare and valuable, packed with calories our bodies needed, and our taste preferences evolved to make us seek them out. The fact that they're now abundant doesn't change our ancient cravings. Think about why we're fascinated by fire, why watching flames is hypnotic, calming. Fire meant safety, warmth, protection from predators, the ability to cook food and gather socially. Our ancestors spent thousands of evenings sitting around fires, and that experience is embedded in us. Think about why we tell stories, why narrative is so powerful, why we'll stay up late reading or watching shows, even when we're exhausted. Stories were how knowledge was transmitted, how group bonds were formed, how meaning was created. We're storytelling animals because stories kept us alive. Think about why we form teams, why we identify with groups, why we'll defend our group against outsiders even when it's not rational. Group cohesion was survival, and we're wired to create and maintain in-groups, to see the world as us versus them, to sacrifice for our group's benefit. All these impulses made sense in the world before civilization. They served important functions, helped us survive and thrive. But they can be maladaptive in the modern world. Craving sugar made sense when it was rare. Craving sugar when it's in every processed food leads to obesity and diabetes. Forming strong in-groups made sense in small bands. Forming strong in-groups in a globalized world leads to tribalism and conflict. Being alert to threats made sense when predators were real. Being alert to threats when threats are rare leads to anxiety disorders. We're running ancient software in a modern context, and sometimes it glitches, produces behaviors that don't serve us well. But understanding where these impulses come from, recognizing them as echoes from our deep past, can help us manage them, make better choices, create lives that honor our nature while adapting to our circumstances. There are things we can learn from the world before civilization, ways of life we might want to reclaim. We can seek out nature, spend time in wild places, reconnect with the environment that shaped us. We can build deeper communities, create social bonds that go beyond superficial interaction, invest in relationships that provide real support and meaning. We can move our bodies more, not in gyms, but in natural ways, walking, climbing, carrying things, using our full physical capacity. We can eat more diverse diets, seek out whole foods, reduce our dependence on processed convenience. We can reduce our possessions, recognize that having too much stuff is burden rather than benefit, that our ancestors lived well with very little. We can tell stories, maintain oral traditions, recognize that not all knowledge needs to be written, that embodied knowledge passed down through demonstration and practice has value. We can create rituals, mark important transitions, give structure and meaning to our lives beyond the secular routines of modern existence. None of this means we should try to go back, to reject civilization and return to hunting and gathering. That's not possible, not practical, probably not desirable for most people. The world has changed too much. There are too many of us, and many of the benefits of civilization are real and worth keeping. But we can be conscious of what we've lost, intentional about reclaiming pieces of it, thoughtful about how we structure our lives and societies. We can ask whether the way we're living serves our deepest needs, whether the trade-offs we've made are worth it, whether there are different choices we could make, that would bring us closer to the life our bodies and minds are adapted for. The world before civilization offers not a blueprint, but a mirror, showing us what humans can be when stripped of all the complexity we've added, revealing the core of human nature that civilization layers over but doesn't erase. There's a moment, impossible to pinpoint but real nonetheless, when the world before civilization ended and something new began. It wasn't a single event. It happened in different places at different times, took different forms in different regions. But there's a threshold, a point of no return, when the old way of life became impossible and the new way became inevitable. In the Fertile Crescent, that moment came around 10,000 years ago, when farming became intensive enough to support permanent settlements, when villages grew into towns, when specialization increased to the point where not everyone was directly involved in food production. In China, it came a bit later, around 8,000 years ago. In Mesoamerica, around 6,000 years ago. In each case, there was a period of transition, a few centuries or millennia, when the old and new coexisted, when people were half farmers and half foragers, when villages were small and simple, but growing more complex. And then, relatively suddenly, the first cities appeared. Uruk in Mesopotamia, around 5,000 years ago, growing to tens of thousands of people. Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, the cities of ancient Egypt, the Olmec centers in Mesoamerica. These weren't just big villages. They were fundamentally different, organized around temples and palaces, ruled by kings and priests, defended by armies supported by extensive agricultural hinterlands. Writing appeared initially for accounting, for keeping track of grain stores and tax collection, but quickly expanding to record laws, stories, history. The first civilizations had emerged, and with them, recorded history began. From this point on, we have written sources. We can read what people thought and said. We're no longer guessing based on archaeology alone. But here's the thing. The vast majority of the world's population wasn't living in cities yet. For thousands of years after the first civilizations arose, most people were still farmers in small villages, still living lives not that different from their ancestors, still connected to the land and the seasons and the old ways. And in many parts of the world, people continued hunting and gathering, living as their ancestors had for hundreds of thousands of years, untouched by civilization. In the Amazon, in the Arctic, in Australia, in the Pacific Islands, in the deserts and forests and mountains, people continued the old life. Some still do today, though they're vanishingly rare, pressured by the expanding world of civilization, their territories shrinking, their ways of life threatened. They're the last connection to the world before civilization, and when they're gone, when the last hunter-gatherer group is absorbed or destroyed or chooses to adopt agriculture and modernity, that connection will be broken. We'll be left only with archaeology and anthropology, with fragments and reconstructions, with our attempts to understand a world we've lost. So what did the world look like before the first civilization? It looked like Earth as it was meant to be, as it evolved to be, as it existed for billions of years before humans, and will exist long after we're gone. It looked wild, untamed, beautiful, dangerous, abundant, harsh, mysterious, and intimately familiar all at once. It looked like home to the people who lived in it, the only home they knew, as real and complete to them as our world is to us. They didn't feel like they were missing something, didn't long for cities or writing or agriculture because they couldn't imagine those things. Their world was enough. It had everything they needed, not for comfort, not for convenience, but for survival, for meaning, for the full expression of human potential within the constraints of that time and place. What did those people experience? They experienced the full range of human emotion and thought. They loved, they grieved, they hoped, they feared, they wondered, they dreamed. They looked at the stars and asked questions. They buried their dead and mourned them. They cared for their children and taught them everything they knew. They laughed around fires and told stories that carried the accumulated wisdom of generations. They created art for no reason except that beauty matters, that expression matters, that leaving a mark on the world matters, even if that mark is just paint on a cave wall that won't be seen for thousands of years. They lived lives as full and meaningful as ours, just different, shaped by different circumstances, guided by different knowledge, but fundamentally human in every way that counts. What can we take from this? Maybe just an awareness that the way we live now isn't the only way, isn't necessarily the best way, is just one possibility among many. That humans are adaptable, creative, resilient, capable of thriving in almost any environment, of building lives of meaning and connection with minimal material resources. That what we think of as human nature, our competitiveness, our violence, our hierarchy, isn't inevitable or natural, but shaped by the structures we've created, and that in different structures, different aspects of human nature come forward. That we carry the world before civilization inside us still, that it shaped us profoundly, that understanding it helps us understand ourselves and make better choices about how we want to live. That the past is not separate from the present, but flows through it, shapes it, echoes in our bones and our dreams and our deepest longings. The world before civilization is gone. We can't go back to it, but we can honor it, learn from it, carry its lessons forward. We can recognize that progress isn't linear, that what we've gained has come at a cost, that some things our ancestors had are worth trying to reclaim in whatever form works in the modern world. We can be grateful for the world we have while acknowledging what was lost. We can build futures that honor our past while embracing our present, that recognize our nature while adapting to our circumstances. The people who lived before civilization weren't waiting for us to arrive, weren't incomplete or primitive or less than fully human. They were us, living their lives, solving their problems, finding meaning and beauty in a wild world that was all they knew and all they needed. If you made it this far, thank you for taking this journey back in time with me. These are the kinds of stories I love exploring. The deep history that shaped us, the forgotten worlds that explain where we come from. If you enjoyed this, maybe subscribe, maybe leave a comment about what struck you, what you wondered about, what you'd like to hear more of. I read every comment, and your thoughts help shape what I create next. Maybe share what time it is where you are, where you're watching from, what the world looks like outside your window right now. We're all connected, all part of the same human story that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years and forward into an unknown future. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Sleep well, and remember, we carry entire worlds inside us, ancient and new, wild and civilized, all woven together into the mystery of being human. Let's go even deeper into what it meant to be human before civilization, to understand not just what people did, but how they thought, how they perceived their world. The tools they made tell us stories if we know how to read them. A stone hand axe from 500,000 years ago is more than just a cutting tool. It's evidence of planning, of abstract thought, of the ability to see something that doesn't exist yet and bring it into being. Someone looked at a rough piece of stone and imagined the shape hidden inside it, then worked systematically to reveal that shape. That requires holding an image in your mind, comparing the reality in your hand to the ideal in your head, making hundreds of precise strikes to remove exactly the right flakes of stone. It requires patience, focus, and understanding of how stone fractures, how force travels through different materials, how angle and pressure affect the result. These weren't simple people making simple tools. They were artists and engineers working within the constraints of their materials and knowledge. And tools evolved, not randomly, not by accident, but through innovation passed down and refined across generations. A stone blade became more sophisticated over time. Someone figured out how to heat-treat stone to make it easier to work. Someone discovered that certain types of stone made better edges. Someone invented hafting, attaching stone points to wooden handles to create spears and axes with greater reach and power. Each innovation built on what came before, and each represented someone noticing something, experimenting, sharing their discovery with others who adopted and improved it. This is culture. This is technology. This is human progress happening at a pace we can barely perceive, but accumulating over tens of thousands of years into a body of knowledge that was sophisticated and effective. By the time civilization emerged, humans had already invented hundreds of technologies: fire-starting methods, clothing, shelter construction, food preservation techniques, medicine made from plants, traps and snares, fishing nets and hooks, bows and arrows, boats, snowshoes, musical instruments, art materials. Everything you needed to survive and even thrive in almost any environment on Earth. Think about the cognitive leap required for some of these inventions. Take the bow and arrow. You need to understand that a bent piece of wood stores energy. You need to figure out how to make string strong and flexible enough to bend the wood without breaking. You need to shape arrows that fly straight, that are weighted properly, that have points sharp enough to penetrate hide. You need to develop the technique of shooting, learning to judge distance and trajectory, practicing until you can hit a moving target. This isn't simple, this is complex engineering and physics, arrived at through observation and experimentation without any formal education or scientific method. Or consider boats. The first person who hollowed out a log or lashed reeds together to make something that floated and could carry a person across water was doing something revolutionary. They were reimagining what was possible, extending human capability into a new realm. And they were doing it without any examples to follow, just imagination and trial and error and probably a lot of failures before they succeeded. Language itself is a technology, maybe the most important one. We don't know when humans developed language, full grammatical language with past and future tenses, subordinate clauses, the ability to express complex abstract ideas. But we know it happened before civilization because all human groups, no matter how isolated, have sophisticated languages. There are no primitive languages, no simple languages that are less capable than others. Every language humans speak, whether it's English or Mandarin, or an isolated tribal language spoken by a few hundred people, is equally complex, equally capable of expressing any thought that humans can think. This tells us that language is ancient, that it developed early in our evolution and has been refined over hundreds of thousands of years. And language changed everything. With language, you can teach without demonstrating. You can explain abstract concepts. You can tell stories that preserve knowledge across generations. You can coordinate complex group activities. You can negotiate, persuade, inspire. You can lie and deceive and manipulate. Language makes us human in a way that no other trait does. What were they thinking about when they sat around fires at night, when they were walking alone through the forest, when they lay awake, unable to sleep? We can't know for certain, but we can guess based on what we know about human nature and what archaeologists have found. They thought about practical things, certainly. Where the herd animals were, whether rain was coming, whether the stored food would last through winter. They thought about people, about relationships and conflicts and bonds. Who could be trusted? Who was reliable? Who needed help? Who posed a threat? They worried about their children, about whether they'd survive, whether they were learning what they needed to know. They missed people who died, remembered them, talked about them. They felt the full range of human emotions because emotions aren't products of civilization. They're products of being human, and they existed in full form long before the first city was built. But they also thought about bigger questions, the questions that have haunted humans forever. Why are we here? What happens when we die? Why does the sun rise and set? Where did the world come from? Why do bad things happen? These aren't modern questions. They're universal human questions, and people before civilization asked them just as intensely as we do. The difference is they didn't have science to answer them. They had only observation, intuition, imagination. So they created myths, stories that explained the world in ways that made sense to them. The sun was a deity traveling across the sky. Thunder was a spirit being angry. Death wasn't the end, but a transition to another realm. Animals had souls, spirits, awareness comparable to humans. The world was alive, animated by forces that could be communicated with, appeased, influenced through ritual and respect. We call these beliefs animism, and we often dismiss them as primitive superstition. But they weren't irrational. They were attempts to make sense of observations, to find patterns, to understand cause and effect. If you perform a ritual before a hunt and the hunt succeeds, the ritual seems to work. If you fail to perform the ritual and the hunt fails, that confirms it. This is correlation being mistaken for causation, yes, but it's how human cognition works. We're pattern-seeking animals, and sometimes we see patterns that aren't there. But sometimes the patterns are real. Plants that grew near water needed water to thrive, so clearing land near water and protecting certain plants made them grow better. That's practical knowledge, arrived at through the same observational process that produced spiritual beliefs. The two weren't separate. They were intertwined, both parts of a unified worldview that explained how the world worked and how to live in it successfully. Archaeologists have found evidence of spiritual life dating back tens of thousands of years. Intentional burials where bodies were placed carefully, sometimes with grave goods, sometimes painted with ochre. Cave paintings that seem to have ritual significance. Animals depicted in ways that suggest they weren't just food, but held spiritual meaning. Carved figurines, particularly female figurines with exaggerated sexual characteristics that might represent fertility goddesses or ancestral spirits. Musical instruments made from bone, which suggests not just practical communication, but art, ritual, celebration. All of this points to an interior life as rich as ours, to people who thought deeply about meaning and purpose, who created stories and rituals to express and explore those thoughts, who found beauty and significance in their world beyond mere survival. Humans didn't stay in one place. That's not in our nature. From our origins in Africa, we spread across the entire world, reaching every continent except Antarctica, adapting to every climate from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra. This expansion happened slowly, over tens of thousands of years, but it represents one of the most remarkable achievements of any species. No other large mammal has ever colonized such diverse environments without evolving into separate species. Humans did it through culture, through technology, through the flexibility of learned behavior rather than genetic adaptation. We didn't evolve different bodies for different climates. We invented clothing, shelter, fire. We learned to eat different foods, to hunt different animals, to gather different plants. We became generalists, able to survive anywhere, and that flexibility allowed us to spread until we'd reached almost everywhere humans could possibly live. The first great migration was out of Africa, probably around 70 to 80,000 years ago, though humans had left Africa before and either died out or returned. This time they succeeded, small groups moving along coastlines, following the shore around the Arabian Peninsula into South Asia, eventually reaching Southeast Asia and Australia. Why did they leave? Maybe population pressure, maybe curiosity, maybe following animal migrations, maybe escaping conflict or environmental change. We don't know. But they went, walking into unknown territories, crossing landscapes that had never seen humans, encountering animals that had never learned to fear us. It must have been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, each generation moving a little farther, exploring a little more, never knowing what lay ahead, but driven by something deep in human nature that says go, see, discover, expand. Other groups went north into Europe, encountering Neanderthals who had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. The two species interacted, interbred, and eventually Neanderthals disappeared, either outcompeted by humans or absorbed into human populations, or both. We carry Neanderthal DNA still, evidence of that ancient mixing, genes that helped our ancestors survive in cold climates, that affect our immune systems and our physical traits in subtle ways. The Neanderthals aren't gone, not entirely. They live on in us, a ghost population preserved in fragments of genetic code. Groups also moved east into Asia, encountering another archaic human species, the Denisovans. And again there was interbreeding, again there was mixing, and again we carry traces of that encounter in our DNA. Human history is more complex than we once thought. Not a simple linear progression, but a branching, merging, complex story of different populations, meeting, mixing, separating, evolving. The migration into the Americas was later, probably around 15 to 20,000 years ago, though the exact timing is debated. Humans crossed from Siberia to Alaska when sea levels were lower and a land bridge existed, or possibly travelled along the coast in boats. Either way, once they arrived, they spread rapidly south, reaching the tip of South America within a few thousand years. This is astonishingly fast, and it raises questions. Were they following animal migrations? Were they fleeing something? Were they just naturally expansionist? We don't know, but the result was that within a relatively short time, humans had colonized 2 entire continents, encountered and hunted megafauna that had never seen humans before, adapted to environments ranging from Arctic ice to tropical rainforest, to high-altitude mountains to coastal deserts. Each new environment required new strategies, new knowledge, new tools, and humans figured it out, every time through observation and experimentation, and the transmission of knowledge from experienced individuals to novices. The Pacific migrations came later still, representing perhaps the most impressive seafaring achievement in human history. People in Southeast Asia developed boats and navigation skills sufficient to cross open ocean, reaching islands that were out of sight of land, that required travelling for days or weeks without seeing anything but water. They reached Australia at least 50,000 years ago, probably much earlier, crossing at least 60 miles of open ocean. They reached the remote Pacific Islands, places like Hawaii and Easter Island and New Zealand, in a series of migrations that continued right up until 1,000 years ago. These weren't accidental. You don't accidentally sail to Hawaii. You navigate, you plan, you carry supplies for a long journey. You understand currents and winds and star navigation. These were skilled mariners, and their achievement is made more impressive by the fact that they did it in canoes and outriggers, without compasses or maps, using only their knowledge of the ocean and sky. Each of these migrations represents countless individual journeys, countless people leaving everything they knew to travel into the unknown. Think about what that means. You're leaving your homeland, the place where your ancestors lived and died, the landscape you know intimately. You're walking into territory where you don't know where water is, where food is, where dangers lurk. Every day brings new challenges, new decisions, new risks. And yet, people did it, generation after generation, spreading across the world, driven by curiosity or necessity or hope or some combination of all three. And they succeeded. By the time civilization emerged, humans were everywhere, had adapted to everywhere, had learned to survive and thrive in almost every environment Earth offers. That's not primitive. That's extraordinary. Let's talk about art, because art tells us something profound about what it means to be human. Art serves no survival function. You don't need to paint pictures to eat or stay warm or avoid predators. And yet humans have always made art, even in the hardest times, even when resources were scarce. The oldest known cave paintings date back at least 40,000 years, and they're not crude or childish. They're sophisticated, beautiful, showing understanding of anatomy and movement and perspective. The artists who made them knew what they were doing. They'd practiced, developed techniques, learned from others. They mixed pigments from minerals and plants and animal fats, creating colors that have lasted 40,000 years. They worked in caves by flickering firelight, climbing to difficult positions to reach the best surfaces, spending hours or days on a single image. Why? What drove them to do this? Maybe it was ritual, part of hunting magic, depicting the animals they hoped to kill. Maybe it was record-keeping, documenting what they'd seen. Maybe it was teaching, showing young people what animals looked like and how they moved. Maybe it was simply expression, the need to create something beautiful, to leave a mark, to say, I was here, I saw this. I thought this was worth preserving. Maybe it was all of these things. Art doesn't have to have one purpose. It can be many things simultaneously, practical and spiritual and aesthetic all at once. What matters is that they did it, that humans 40,000 years ago felt compelled to create images, to engage with the world not just practically, but artistically. That tells us they had the same aesthetic sense we have, the same appreciation for beauty, the same need to express interior experiences in exterior forms. And it wasn't just painting. They carved figurines, tiny sculptures of animals and humans, some realistic, some abstract, some emphasizing certain features while ignoring others. The Venus figurines, female forms with exaggerated breasts and hips and bellies, have been found across Europe, suggesting either widespread cultural contact or independent development of similar symbolic forms. What did these represent? Fertility goddesses, portraits of real women, idealized forms, sexual objects. We don't know, but they meant something to the people who made them, something important enough to invest time and skill in creating them. They made jewelry, beads and pendants from shells and stones and teeth, decorating themselves even in times of scarcity. This wasn't vanity, not exactly. It was self-expression, identity, the need to mark yourself as an individual, as a member of a group, as someone with aesthetic preferences and values. They made music. We've found bone flutes dating back 40,000 years, capable of playing recognizable melodies. Someone made these, carved holes at precise locations to create specific notes, tested and refined them until they sounded right. And then, someone played them, creating sounds that went beyond communication into something else, something that moved people emotionally, that brought the group together, that expressed feelings words couldn't capture. Music is universal among human cultures. Every group has it, and it's ancient, reaching back to our pre-civilization ancestors and probably much further. Why do humans make music? Because we're emotional beings, because we need ways to express and share feelings, because music creates bonds and synchronizes groups and marks important moments with appropriate gravity or joy. They told stories, though we can only guess at what those stories were since they weren't written down. But every human culture tells stories, and there's no reason to think pre-civilization humans were different. They told stories about successful hunts, about dangerous encounters with predators, about places where food was abundant or water was scarce. They told stories about their ancestors, about legendary figures who performed great deeds. They told stories to explain natural phenomena, the changing seasons, the movements of celestial bodies, the origins of animals and plants, and humans themselves. These stories served multiple functions. They were entertainment during long winter nights. They were education, encoding practical knowledge in memorable narrative form. They were social cohesion, creating shared identity and values. They were meaning-making, answering the big questions that every human asks. And they were art, crafted narratives with character and plot and emotional impact, designed to move the audience, to make them laugh or cry or feel wonder or fear. We need to talk about violence, about the darker aspects of life before civilization. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine it as a peaceful paradise where people lived in harmony with nature and each other. That's not true. Humans have always been capable of violence, and archaeological evidence shows they exercise that capability regularly. We've found skeletons with healed fractures from blows to the head, with projectile points embedded in bones, with cut marks that suggest scalping or trophy-taking. We've found mass graves suggesting warfare, burial sites where all the dead show signs of violent death. Violence existed, and it existed for the same reasons it exists today. Competition for resources, revenge for real or perceived wrongs, defense of territory, raiding for captives or goods. Sometimes just aggression, young males proving themselves, establishing dominance, working out hierarchies through confrontation. But violence in pre-civilization societies was different from violence in civilized societies in important ways. It was usually small-scale, conflicts between groups of a few dozen people rather than armies of thousands or millions. It was often ritualized, conducted according to rules that everyone understood, with the goal of establishing dominance or securing resources rather than complete annihilation of the enemy. And it coexisted with strong social norms against violence within the group. You might raid another group, but killing someone in your own group was almost always severely punished, usually by exile, which was effectively a death sentence since survival alone was nearly impossible. Internal violence was controlled because it had to be. Groups that tolerated too much internal conflict didn't survive. They fell apart, were conquered by more cohesive groups, failed to cooperate effectively enough to deal with external threats and environmental challenges. Warfare intensified as populations grew and resources became more concentrated, particularly in the period just before civilization when some groups were starting to settle down, to farm, to accumulate storable surpluses. Now there were things worth stealing: stored grain and domesticated animals and permanent structures. Now there were clear boundaries. This is our land, not yours, and reasons to defend those boundaries aggressively. The transition to agriculture brought new forms of violence, more organized, more destructive, setting the stage for the warfare of civilized societies. But even in pre-civilization times, violence was present, a shadow running through human history, something we have to acknowledge and grapple with. We're not naturally peaceful any more than we're naturally violent. We're capable of both, and which predominates depends on circumstances, on how we organize our societies, on the incentives and norms we create. There was also violence against women, almost certainly. In most hunter-gatherer societies, women had more autonomy and equality than in later agricultural societies. But that doesn't mean they had perfect equality or that they were never abused. Sexual coercion existed, domestic violence existed. Women sometimes had less say in decisions than men. The specifics varied from group to group, some more egalitarian than others, but patriarchy in various forms has been common across human cultures, suggesting deep roots that probably extend back before civilization. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but it's important to see the past clearly, not as we wish it had been, but as it likely was, complex and contradictory, containing both admirable and troubling elements. And so we come full circle, back to the threshold we mentioned before, the moment when everything changed. Imagine you're living 12,000 years ago in the Levant. Your life isn't that different from your ancestors' lives, stretching back tens of thousands of years. You move with the seasons, following game and gathering plants. You live in temporary shelters or caves. Your group is small, everyone knows everyone. You share everything because that's how you survive. But things are starting to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The climate is warmer now, more stable than it's been in millennia. The wild grains in the river valleys are abundant, so abundant that your group doesn't have to move as much. You're spending more time in one place, harvesting the grain, storing it in pits you've dug. Someone builds a more permanent structure, and then someone else does. Without quite deciding to, your group is becoming sedentary. Other groups are doing the same thing. You encounter them more often now that everyone's less mobile. Sometimes there's conflict, competition for the best harvesting sites. But sometimes there's cooperation, intermarriage, trade. The groups are merging, forming larger communities, and with larger communities come new social structures. Someone has to organize the harvest, distribute the stored grain, settle disputes between families who didn't used to live together. Leadership becomes more formal, more permanent. Some families become more powerful, more wealthy, because they're better at managing resources or because they control key sites, or just because they're good at accumulating power. Inequality is growing, slowly, generation by generation, until some people are clearly at the top of the social hierarchy and others are at the bottom. And you're experimenting with the plants now, not just harvesting them, but actively planting them, clearing ground, protecting them, saving the best seeds for next year. Over generations, the plants are changing, becoming more useful to you, and you're changing too, becoming more dependent on them, less mobile, more invested in particular pieces of land. You can't just walk away anymore because you've built structures, invested labor in clearing and planting, stored surpluses that represent survival. You're tied to this place now, for better or worse. And with that commitment comes the need to defend it, to keep others from taking what you've created, to maintain boundaries and hierarchies and rules that keep everything functioning. You're building civilization, though you don't know that word, don't have that concept. You're just trying to survive, to feed your family, to adapt to changing circumstances. But the old world is fading, the world of endless horizons and nomadic freedom, and something new is being born. Within a few more generations, your descendants will be living in actual villages, permanent settlements with dozens or hundreds of people. The work will be harder, the diet less varied, the diseases more common. But the population will be larger, the social structures more complex, the technologies more advanced. Specialists will emerge, people who don't farm but make pots or weave cloth or work metal. Leaders will become hereditary chiefs, then kings. Religion will become organized with priests and temples. Writing will be invented to keep track of surpluses and taxes. And within a few thousand years, the first true cities will rise, with thousands of inhabitants, massive public works, armies, bureaucracies, all the trappings of civilization. The world before civilization will be over, remembered only in myths and stories that become increasingly distorted over time, until eventually even the stories fade and only archaeology remains to tell us what was lost. The people living through this transition couldn't see the full scope of what was happening. They couldn't know that their grandchildren's grandchildren would live in cities, would serve kings, would follow laws written on stone tablets, would worship in temples dedicated to gods who demanded sacrifice and obedience. They were just making small choices, practical decisions about where to live and what to plant and how to organize their communities. But those small choices accumulated into something massive, something that transformed the world completely and irreversibly. Once you start down the path to civilization, there's no going back. The population grows too large to be supported by hunting and gathering. The social structures become too complex to dismantle. The knowledge of how to live the old way is forgotten. Within a few generations, the very idea of living without agriculture, without permanent settlements, without social hierarchy becomes unthinkable. The old world is gone, and a new world has taken its place, a world that would be completely alien to those who lived before. And here we are, thousands of years later, the inheritors of that transformation, living in a world that would be absolutely incomprehensible to our pre-civilization ancestors. They couldn't imagine cities with millions of people, buildings that touch the sky, machines that fly, the ability to communicate instantly across the world, the capacity to destroy the entire planet with weapons we've created. But in some ways, we're not so different from them. We have the same brains, the same capacity for thought and feeling, the same fundamental human needs for food and safety and connection and meaning. We're just meeting those needs in radically different ways, using technologies and social structures they couldn't have dreamed of. But the needs remain, the drives remain, the fundamental human nature remains. We're still the same species that walked out of Africa tens of thousands of years ago, that spread across the world, that learned to survive in every environment, that created art and music and stories, that looked at the stars and wondered what they meant. We're still those people, just wearing different clothes, living in different houses, working different jobs. But underneath it all, we're the same. And maybe understanding that, understanding where we came from and who we were before civilization, can help us understand who we are now and who we might become. The world before civilization is gone. This video contains fictional and/or AI-assisted elements created for artistic and entertainment purposes. It does not aim to mislead viewers or present real-world events as factual documentation. Civilization is gone forever. We can't resurrect it, can't go back to it even if we wanted to. But we can remember it, honor it, learn from it. We can recognize that the human story is longer and deeper than the history of civilization, that our species existed successfully for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone built a city, or planted a field, or wrote a word. We can acknowledge that civilization brought both gains and losses, benefits and costs, and that neither romanticizing the past nor dismissing it serves us well. The past is part of us, shapes us, echoes in our bones and brains, even when we're not aware of it. And by understanding that past, by connecting with it, by seeing our pre-civilization ancestors as fully human as complex and thoughtful and creative as we are, we can better understand ourselves and make wiser choices about our future. Because the future is unwritten. We're still making choices, still adapting, still changing the world and being changed by it. The agricultural revolution was one transformation. The industrial revolution was another. The digital revolution is happening now, and who knows what comes next. Each transformation brings new possibilities and new problems, new freedoms and new constraints. And through it all, we're still human, still carrying the legacy of those who came before, still trying to survive and thrive and find meaning in a complex world. The world before civilization teaches us that humans are adaptable, resilient, creative, capable of surviving almost anything. It teaches us that we don't need much in material terms to live meaningful lives, that community and connection matter more than possessions, that beauty and art and story are as essential as food and water. It teaches us to pay attention to the world around us, to notice patterns and cycles, to work with nature rather than against it. These are lessons we need now more than ever as we face challenges our ancestors couldn't have imagined, but that require the same human qualities they developed over hundreds of thousands of years of survival in a wild world. So sleep well tonight, knowing you're part of a story that stretches back further than you can imagine, that you carry within you the experiences and adaptations and wisdom of countless generations who survived impossible odds to bring you into existence. You're the product of an unbroken chain extending back hundreds of thousands of years, every single one of your ancestors surviving long enough to reproduce, passing their genes and their knowledge down the line until finally, incredibly, here you are. That's your inheritance. That's your birthright. You're the heir to the world before civilization, carrying its legacy forward into an uncertain future. Make it count. Honor those who came before by living fully, by adapting to your circumstances as they adapted to theirs, by finding meaning and beauty and connection in whatever world you inhabit. That's what it means to be human. That was true before civilization, and it's still true now. There's something we haven't fully explored yet, something that matters deeply when trying to understand the world before civilization. The ways people communicated went far beyond words. Yes, they had language, sophisticated spoken language that could express complex ideas. But they also had entire systems of non-verbal communication that we've mostly lost, ways of reading the world and each other that required no words at all. When you live in small groups where everyone knows everyone, when survival depends on cooperation and understanding, you develop an acute sensitivity to non-verbal cues. A slight change in posture, a particular expression, the way someone holds their body, all of these communicate volumes without a single word being spoken. You learn to read moods, intentions, thoughts from tiny signals that most modern people would never notice. This isn't mystical or supernatural. It's skill developed through necessity and practice, refined over a lifetime of close observation. And you learn to read the landscape itself, to see stories written in tracks and signs that are invisible to the untrained eye. A bent blade of grass tells you something passed this way recently. The direction it's bent tells you which way. The depth of the impression tells you how heavy. The spacing tells you how fast it was moving. The shape, if you're skilled enough, tells you what kind of animal. And this is just the beginning. You can tell how fresh the tracks are by how crisp the edges are, whether dew has formed in them, whether they've been disturbed by wind or rain. You can follow an animal for miles, reading its story in the marks it leaves, understanding whether it was healthy or injured, calm or panicked, alone or with others. This knowledge isn't written anywhere. It can't be learned from books. It has to be taught through demonstration and absorbed through practice, thousands of hours of observation until the signs become as readable as text is to us. The same with weather. You learn to read clouds, to know which formations mean rain is coming, which mean it's passing over, which mean a storm is building. You learn to feel shifts in temperature and humidity, to notice when the wind changes direction, to hear how sound carries differently when the air is dense with moisture. You know that certain birds fly low before a storm, that certain insects become more active, that certain smells intensify. You're constantly processing information from the environment, not consciously, just absorbing it, letting it inform your decisions about whether to travel or stay put, whether to hunt or take shelter. This is situational awareness at a level most modern humans never develop, because we don't need it. We have weather forecasts and climate-controlled buildings and warnings on our phones. But take away all that technology, and you'd need to develop these skills, or you'd be constantly surprised by conditions that could kill you. And then there's reading people, understanding social dynamics, navigating the complex web of relationships that hold a group together. You know who has influence, who people listen to, who can be relied on in a crisis. You know who gets along with whom, who has old grudges, who has romantic interest in whom. You know all of this because you pay attention, because you watch how people interact, because you're tuned into the social environment as carefully as the physical one. When someone speaks, you're listening not just to their words, but to their tone, their timing, their body language. You're noticing who responds and how, who remains silent, who exchanges glances with others. You're reading the room, constantly, automatically, because misunderstanding social dynamics could have serious consequences. In a small group where everyone depends on everyone else, maintaining harmony is crucial, and that requires constant attention to the subtle currents of human interaction. Here's something that haunts me when I think about the world before civilization. The amount of knowledge that existed in every single person's head was staggering. Not academic knowledge, not facts memorized from books, but embodied practical knowledge gained through direct experience. Every adult knew hundreds, probably thousands of plants by sight, by smell, by touch. They knew which were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They knew when each one flowered, when it fruited, where it grew, how to process it. They knew dozens or hundreds of animals, their behaviors, their patterns, their weaknesses. They knew the landscape for many miles in every direction, every water source, every good camping site, every dangerous area. They knew how to make fire in various conditions, how to make tools from different materials, how to build shelters, how to navigate by stars and landmarks, how to find food in any season. They knew weather patterns, seasonal cycles, the movements of celestial bodies. And they knew stories, hundreds of stories, each one encoding information about the world, about their history, about their values and beliefs. These stories weren't entertainment separate from education. They were the education, the way knowledge was stored and transmitted in a world without writing. A story about an ancestor who survived a winter by finding a particular plant wasn't just a nice tale. It was a survival manual teaching you what that plant looked like, where to find it, how to prepare it. A story about a hero who outwitted a dangerous animal wasn't just adventure. It was instruction in how that animal behaved and how to survive an encounter with it. Every story served multiple purposes, and people who knew many stories knew how to survive many situations. The elders, who had lived longest and accumulated the most experience, were libraries of knowledge, irreplaceable repositories of information that took a lifetime to gather. When an elder died, An entire library died with them. All that knowledge potentially lost unless it had been successfully transmitted to others. This creates a very different relationship with knowledge than we have today. We externalize knowledge, store it in books and computers, assume it will always be available when we need it. But they had to internalize everything, carry it in their heads because there was nowhere else to put it. This meant constant review, constant practice, constant storytelling to reinforce the knowledge, keep it alive, pass it on. It meant that education wasn't something that happened in childhood and then stopped. It was lifelong, continuous, because you were always learning new things, refining your understanding, teaching what you knew to others. And it meant that knowledge was social, shared, part of the collective wisdom of the group rather than individual possession. You learned from everyone and taught everyone. Knowledge flowed through the group like water, nourishing everyone, ensuring that no single person's death would destroy what the group needed to survive. But here's what we've lost. That kind of knowledge, that intimate familiarity with the natural world, that ability to read signs and patterns and understand complex systems through direct observation, is mostly gone. Most modern people couldn't survive a week in the wilderness without technology. We don't know which plants are edible, we can't track animals or predict weather or navigate without GPS. We've externalized so much knowledge that we've lost the ability to embody it, to know it in our bones and muscles and senses. We've gained the ability to access vast amounts of information, yes, but we've lost the deep, intimate, embodied knowledge that comes only through years of direct experience and attention. And with that loss comes a kind of alienation from the natural world, a sense that we're separate from it, observers rather than participants, consumers rather than members of the ecosystem. Our pre-civilization ancestors didn't feel that separation. They were part of the world, deeply embedded in it, unable to imagine themselves as separate from the landscapes and creatures around them. That's a kind of knowledge we desperately need to recover, even if we can never fully return to the way they lived. Let's talk about what it was like to grow up before civilization, because childhood was radically different then. From the moment you could walk, you were learning, absorbing knowledge, developing skills that would keep you alive. There was no separation between childhood and adult life. No extended period of dependency where you were sheltered from reality. You saw everything. You saw animals being killed and butchered. You saw births, including human births. You saw deaths, saw bodies being prepared for burial, or being left for scavengers. You saw violence, saw conflicts between adults, saw the consequences of accidents and diseases. Nothing was hidden from you because hiding things wasn't practical in small groups where everyone lived in close proximity and privacy barely existed. So you grew up with a realistic, unsanitized understanding of what life involved, and you learned to cope with that reality from an early age. But you also had freedoms that modern children don't have. You spent most of your time playing, and play was how you learned. You played hunting games with other children, stalking each other through the forest, learning to move quietly, to observe without being seen. You played gathering games, competing to find specific plants or objects, developing the visual search skills you'd need as an adult. You played with tools, practiced making stone blades and tying knots and starting fires, learning through trial and error, under the casual supervision of adults who would step in if you were doing something dangerous, but otherwise let you figure things out. You had real responsibilities from a young age, but they were appropriate to your capabilities and integrated into play. Carrying water, gathering firewood, watching younger children, these were tasks you could handle and they made you feel useful, part of the group, contributing to survival even as a child. You were rarely alone. You were always surrounded by other children, by adults, by the whole group. This meant constant social interaction, constant learning through observation and imitation, constant feedback about your behavior. You learned social skills naturally through immersion, the same way you learned language. You learned to share, to cooperate, to read social cues, to navigate conflicts, not through explicit instruction, but through thousands of interactions with others. You learned your place in the group, understood the relationships between people, absorbed the values and norms that governed behavior. And you learned by watching adults do real work, not simplified versions designed for children, but the actual skills you'd need as an adult. A boy would watch men hunt, observe their techniques, eventually join them on hunts when he was old enough, gradually taking on more responsibility until he was a full participant. A girl would watch women gather, learn to identify plants and process materials, develop the skills she'd need to contribute to the group's survival. But here's something important. The transition to adulthood wasn't arbitrary. It was marked by real capability. You became an adult when you could perform adult tasks, when you demonstrated the skills and knowledge necessary to survive. This happened gradually, through increasing participation in adult activities, until at some point, often marked by a ritual or ceremony, you were recognized as a full member of adult society. This might happen in your early teens, or it might happen later, depending on the individual and the group's standards. But it was based on ability, on demonstration of competence, not on reaching a particular age. This gave young people strong motivation to learn, to develop skills, to prove themselves. And it meant that by the time someone was considered an adult, they genuinely had the knowledge and capability to survive, to contribute, to make decisions. They weren't just older children being granted adult status arbitrarily. They were genuinely capable adults who had earned that recognition through years of learning and practice. Time worked differently before civilization. Not just the daily rhythms we've discussed, but the sense of history, of connection to the past. Without writing, without fixed dates, without the kind of record-keeping that civilization enables, people's sense of time was more fluid, more mythological. The distant past wasn't precisely dated. It was long ago in the time of the ancestors, in the dream time. Events from decades ago might blur together, might be conflated with events from generations ago, might be mixed with mythological elements until it was impossible to separate what actually happened from what people believed happened. This wasn't falsehood or confusion. It was a different way of relating to the past, one that emphasized meaning over precision, story over fact, continuity over change. The past was alive in a way it isn't for us. Your ancestors weren't distant historical figures. They were real people whose stories you knew intimately, whose personalities were described in detail, who felt present, even though they were long dead. You knew their names, their deeds, their relationships. You knew which plants they discovered, which techniques they invented, which territories they explored. They lived on in stories, in the landscape, in the skills and knowledge they'd passed down. When you used a particular hunting technique, you were using something your great-grandfather had perfected. When you harvested a particular plant, you were following in the footsteps of ancestors who had done the same thing in the same place for countless generations. The past wasn't separate from the present. It flowed into it, shaped it, was part of it. Every action you took connected you to the chain of ancestors stretching back into the mists of time. And this created a sense of responsibility. You weren't just living for yourself. You were a link in a chain, responsible for passing on what you'd received, for maintaining the knowledge and traditions and relationships that had sustained your people through countless hardships. You owed the past a debt, owed it to your ancestors to honor their memory by surviving, by thriving, by passing on what they'd given you. And you owed the future the same thing, owed it to your descendants to give them the same gift, to ensure that the chain continued, that the knowledge survived, that the group endured. This sense of transgenerational obligation created a kind of immortality. You might die, but the group would continue, and you'd live on through your descendants, through the stories they told about you, through the knowledge you'd passed on, through your contribution to the collective survival of your people. But there was also loss, profound loss that we can barely imagine. When an elder died, especially an elder with rare knowledge, what they knew might die with them. If they hadn't successfully transmitted all their knowledge to younger people, it was simply gone. A medicinal plant that only they knew about might be forgotten. A story that only they remembered might vanish. A technique they'd perfected might be lost. The group would be poorer for it, less capable, more vulnerable. This is why teaching was so important, why elders spent so much time with younger people, telling stories, demonstrating skills, ensuring that nothing was lost. But loss was inevitable. Accidents happened, diseases struck, people died before they could pass on everything they knew. And with each death, the collective knowledge of humanity shrank slightly, lost things that might have been valuable, might have been crucial, but were now irretrievable. Imagine how many discoveries, how many innovations, how many insights were lost over the hundreds of thousands of years before writing, simply because the people who held that knowledge died before they could pass it on, or because the people they taught died before they could teach others. The knowledge we received from our pre-civilization ancestors is just a fraction of what once existed, a pale shadow of the full richness of what was known in the world before civilization. We need to understand that the division between sacred and mundane, between spiritual and practical, between religion and daily life, didn't exist in the way it does for us. Everything was potentially sacred. Everything was potentially imbued with spiritual significance. A rock wasn't just a rock. It might be a tool, a weapon, a gift from the earth, a home for a spirit, a piece of the body of an ancestral being. A tree wasn't just a resource. It was a living entity with its own spirit, something to be respected, something you might need to ask permission from before cutting. An animal wasn't just food. It was a being with agency and awareness, something you honored, something you thanked for giving its life to sustain yours. The landscape itself was alive, full of meanings and stories and sacred sites where the ancestors walked, where important events occurred, where the boundary between the visible and invisible world was thin. This animistic worldview, common across pre-civilization cultures, wasn't primitive or childish. It was a sophisticated way of relating to the world, one that recognized the complexity and mystery of nature, that embedded humans within rather than separate from the ecosystem. When you see the world as alive, as full of other-than-human persons deserving of respect, you behave differently. You take what you need, but you don't waste. You kill animals for food, but you do it respectfully, honoring the animal's sacrifice. You gather plants, but you don't harvest all of them, leaving some to regenerate, ensuring that future generations will have the same resources. This isn't conservation in our sense based on scientific understanding of ecology and sustainability. It's based on relationship, on reciprocity, on the understanding that you're part of a web of relationships with other beings, and maintaining those relationships requires respect and restraint. Rituals weren't separate from daily life. They were woven through it, marking important moments, transitions, changes. Before a hunt, rituals to honor the animals and ask for success. After a hunt, rituals to thank the animals for their sacrifice. At birth, rituals to welcome the new person and ask for protection. At death, rituals to help the person's spirit transition and to comfort the living. At the change of seasons, rituals to mark the passage and ensure that the cycles would continue. These rituals weren't optional extras, nice but unnecessary. They were essential, part of how you maintained relationship with the world, how you made sense of existence, how you dealt with the big transitions and uncertainties that every human faces. They provided structure, meaning, community, comfort. They connected you to your ancestors who had performed the same rituals and to your descendants who would perform them after you were gone. And they worked, not in any supernatural sense necessarily, but psychologically and socially. Performing a ritual before a hunt focused your mind, prepared you mentally, increased your confidence. Performing rituals together strengthened group bonds, created shared experience, synchronized everyone's intentions. Rituals around death helped people process grief, gave them something to do when they felt helpless, provided closure. The effectiveness of these rituals didn't depend on whether the spirits they invoked were real. It depended on their psychological and social functions, on the meanings they created and the feelings they channeled and the connections they fostered. And in those senses, they absolutely worked, which is why humans have always done them, why we still do them even in our secular modern societies, though we often don't recognize them as rituals anymore. Here's something crucial that we often overlook. The world before civilization wasn't uniform. It wasn't one way of life practiced everywhere. It was incredibly diverse, thousands of different groups living in thousands of different ways, adapted to their particular environments, developed their particular cultures, spoke their particular languages. A group living on the Arctic coast hunting seals and whales lived completely differently from a group in the Amazon rainforest. A group in the Australian outback had nothing in common with a group in the African savanna, except their shared humanity. The technologies differed, the social structures differed, the beliefs differed. Some groups were egalitarian, others had hierarchies. Some emphasized individual autonomy, others emphasized group conformity. Some were peaceful, others warlike. Some had complex art and music, others were more focused on practical survival. Every imaginable variation of human social organization existed somewhere, being tested, being refined, being passed down through generations. And this diversity was valuable. It meant that humans were experimenting with different ways of living, different solutions to the problems of survival and meaning. Some solutions worked better than others in particular environments. Some spread to neighboring groups through contact and exchange. Some died out when the groups that practiced them died out or changed. But the diversity ensured that somewhere, someone was finding better ways to do things, innovations that might spread and benefit everyone. The invention of the bow and arrow, the development of new food processing techniques, the discovery of medicinal plants, these innovations happened in specific places and then spread outward through trade networks and cultural exchange, eventually benefiting groups who never met the original innovators. This is cultural evolution in action, the gradual accumulation of knowledge and technology through experimentation and selection, operating across the vast diversity of human groups and environments. But civilization reduced this diversity dramatically. As agriculture spread, as populations grew, as states formed and empires expanded, many of these diverse ways of life disappeared. Groups were conquered, absorbed, displaced. Languages died out. Cultural practices were lost. Technologies were forgotten. The world became more uniform, more standardized, as civilization imposed its patterns over the older, more diverse patterns of pre-civilization life. This was a loss, a real loss, though it's hard to quantify. We lost experiments in human living, alternatives to civilization, different ways of being human that might have offered insights we needed. Some of these ways of life survived in isolated pockets, continuing right up to the present day, and anthropologists have learned an enormous amount from studying them. But they're vanishing now, the last representatives of the world before civilization being absorbed into the modern world. And when they're gone, we'll have lost something irreplaceable. A window into our deep past, into the vast majority of human history when life was lived in ways civilization can barely imagine. Imagine the stories that were lost, the epics that were told around 10,000 fires over 100,000 years, the heroes whose names are forgotten, the great hunts, the terrible disasters, the migrations and discoveries and conflicts that shaped human history but left no record except in the genes and cultures they influenced. Every group had their stories, their legends, their mythology. Some were shared across groups, spreading through the invisible networks of trade and contact. Some were unique, specific to one group, one place, one moment in time. And almost all of them are gone now, lost when the last person who remembered them died, leaving no trace except perhaps in archaeological fragments that we struggle to interpret. Think about what we've lost. The true story of how humans first left Africa, who led them, what motivated them, what they encountered. The story of the first crossing to Australia, the voyages across open ocean that must have been epic adventures, worthy of any modern epic tale. The story of the Bering Crossing, the first humans to set foot in the Americas, walking into a virgin world filled with animals that had never seen humans before. The story of the last Neanderthals, the final encounters between two human species, the mixing and conflict and eventual disappearance of an entire branch of humanity. The story of the Ice Age, how humans survived it, what they experienced during those long, cold millennia when glaciers covered continents and the world was colder and harsher than anything we know. The story of the megafauna extinctions, the hunting of mammoths and giant sloths, and all the other magnificent beasts that once roamed the earth, but are now gone. These stories existed. People lived them, told them, passed them down. But they didn't survive long enough to be written down, and so they're lost to us forever. Or maybe not entirely lost. Maybe fragments survive in myths and legends, distorted beyond recognition, but preserving some kernel of historical truth. Maybe stories of floods preserve memory of the sea level rise after the Ice Age, when coastlines were drowned and coastal settlements disappeared beneath the waves. Maybe stories of monsters and giants preserve memory of the megafauna, the giant animals that ancient humans actually encountered. Maybe stories of lost paradises preserve memory of particularly abundant regions, or times before climate change or overhunting reduced resources. Scholars debate these possibilities, try to separate mythological accretion from historical core, but it's difficult, probably impossible to be certain. What we're left with is tantalizing hints, suggestions, possibilities, but not the full stories, not the rich detail that must have existed when these stories were fresh, when they were told by people who remembered or who had heard from those who remembered. And beyond the great epic stories, think about all the small stories, the personal stories, the daily dramas that make up actual human life. The love stories, the rivalries, the friendships, the betrayals, the triumphs and failures of ordinary people living ordinary lives. These stories weren't preserved because they weren't considered important enough, but they were the fabric of human experience, the real texture of life before civilization. A woman who developed a new food processing technique, a man who became the best hunter in his group, a child who survived an animal attack, an elder who told the best stories, a couple who loved each other deeply despite opposition, a conflict between neighbors that was resolved creatively, a group decision that changed the trajectory of a community. These moments happened billions of times over hundreds of thousands of years, and they're all lost, all forgotten, leaving us with only the bare archaeological traces of human presence, nothing of the individual lives that were actually lived. But here's something remarkable. Even though the world before civilization is gone, even though it ended thousands of years ago in most places, it hasn't entirely disappeared. It persists in fragments, in survivals, in the cultures and practices of people who maintained the old ways long after civilization arose around them. Until very recently, until the last century or two, there were still groups of people living essentially as their ancestors had before civilization, hunting and gathering, moving with the seasons, living in small groups, maintaining oral traditions. Anthropologists studied these groups intensively, learning everything they could about pre-civilization life from people who were actually living it. And what they learned was revolutionary, transformed our understanding of human nature and history. They learned that hunter-gatherers weren't starving savages living on the brink of survival. They were often well-fed, healthy, with more leisure time than farmers or modern workers. They learned that these societies weren't necessarily patriarchal or violent or hierarchical. Many were remarkably egalitarian, with women having substantial autonomy and authority, with violence being rare, with leadership being situational rather than permanent. They learned that these people weren't intellectually inferior or childlike. They had sophisticated knowledge systems, complex languages, rich artistic and spiritual lives. They were fully human in every sense, just living differently, adapted to different circumstances, preserving ways of life that worked successfully for hundreds of thousands of years. This challenge deeply held assumptions about progress, about civilization being inevitable and superior, about human nature being naturally competitive and hierarchical. It showed that many things we think of as universal human traits are actually products of civilization, of agriculture and settlement and hierarchy, not inherent to being human. But even as anthropologists were learning this, the groups they studied were disappearing, being displaced by expanding agricultural and industrial societies, losing their territories, their resources, their autonomy. Many were forced onto reserves, pressured to abandon their traditional ways, their children taken and educated in boarding schools designed to eliminate their cultures. Languages died as the last speakers died, without passing them on to children who were speaking the national language of whatever country now claimed their territory. Sacred sites were destroyed by development. Hunting and gathering grounds were turned into farms or ranches or mines. The old ways became impossible to maintain, and groups that had persisted for tens of thousands of years vanished in a generation or two, absorbed into modernity, leaving behind only fragmentary records in the notes of the anthropologists who studied them and the memories of the last people who lived the old life. A few groups persist today, but they're under constant pressure, their territories shrinking, their ways of life increasingly difficult to maintain. They're not pristine relics of the past, unchanged since time immemorial. They've always been changing, adapting, interacting with neighbors, adopting new technologies when they're useful. They're not windows into some frozen past, but living cultures in their own right, deserving of respect and autonomy, regardless of how they relate to our understanding of pre-civilization life. But they are the last link to that world, the last people who maintain some continuity with the pre-civilization past. And when they're gone, when the last hunter-gatherer group either vanishes or voluntarily transitions to agriculture or wage labor, that link will be broken. We'll be left with only archaeology and anthropology, second-hand knowledge, reconstructions and guesses, unable to ask questions of people who actually lived the life we're trying to understand. So we come back to where we started, to the fundamental question that motivated this entire exploration. What did the world look like before the first civilization? We've described the physical world, the landscapes and animals and climate. We've described the human world, the groups and relationships and knowledge systems. We've described the interior world, the thoughts and feelings and beliefs. But have we answered the question? Can it even be answered? Because the world before civilization wasn't one world. It was thousands of worlds, as different from each other as they were from anything we know today. And yet there were commonalities, threads running through all these diverse experiences, things that made them recognizably human, recognizably part of our shared past. The connection to nature, the importance of relationships, the transmission of knowledge through story and demonstration, the marking of important moments with ritual, the creation of meaning through art and spirituality, the adaptability and creativity that allowed humans to spread across the entire world and survive everything it threw at them. And maybe that's the answer. The world before civilization looked like a world where humans were fully themselves, fully human, expressing the complete range of human potential within the constraints and opportunities of their time and place. It looked like a world where diversity flourished, where different groups found different solutions to the challenges of existence, where innovation and tradition coexisted, where change happened slowly enough that each generation could learn from the previous one, but fast enough that adaptation was always happening. It looked like a world that was harsh and generous, dangerous and beautiful, demanding and rewarding, a world that required everything from you, but gave you everything you needed if you were skilled and lucky and had good companions. It looked like home to the people who lived in it, the only home they knew, as complete and meaningful to them as our world is to us. Maybe more so because they couldn't imagine any alternative, couldn't dream of living any other way. And here's the final thought, the one that keeps circling back no matter how far we explore this topic. That world is still with us. Not literally, not in a way we can return to, but it's in us, shapes us, influences us, even when we're not aware of it. We carry it in our genes, in our instincts, in our deep preferences and aversions that made sense in that world, even if they don't always make sense now. We carry it in our capacity for language and art and story, in our need for community and meaning, in our ability to adapt and learn and create. We carry it in our restlessness, our curiosity, our urge to explore and discover and understand. These aren't modern traits. These are ancient traits forged over hundreds of thousands of years of pre-civilization life, encoded so deeply in human nature that they persist no matter how much our circumstances change. The world before civilization made us who we are, and we can't escape that, can't transcend it, can only acknowledge it and try to understand what it means for how we live today and how we might live tomorrow. And in that understanding, in that acknowledgement, maybe we can find wisdom, guidance, perspective that helps us navigate our strange modern world with some of the adaptability and creativity and community spirit that allowed our ancestors to thrive in theirs. That's the gift the world before civilization offers us. Not a blueprint for return, but a mirror for reflection, showing us who we were, and therefore who we are, and therefore who we might yet become. Before we close, there's one last thing to consider, something that's been implicit in everything we've discussed, but needs to be said explicitly. The world before civilization was quiet in a way we can barely comprehend. Not silent, never silent, but quiet. The soundscape was natural, unmediated by machines or mass human activity. When you woke in the morning, you heard birds, wind, maybe water flowing, maybe the movements of other people in your group. That was it. No traffic, no engines, no electrical hum, no sirens or alarms or notifications. Just the sounds that the world makes naturally, the sounds that humans evolved listening to, that our brains are calibrated to process and understand. This had profound effects on consciousness, on attention, on the quality of experience. You could hear things we can't hear anymore, subtle sounds masked by ambient noise. The crack of a twig under an animal's foot, the rustle of leaves as weather changes, the distant call of another human group. Your ears were tuned to these sounds, could distinguish them instantly, could interpret them accurately because your life depended on it. And in the quiet, thoughts had different quality. Without constant external stimulation, without the barrage of information and entertainment and interruption that defines modern life, the mind settled into different patterns. Deeper focus on immediate experience. More attention to physical sensations, to the body, to the environment. More room for contemplation, for letting thoughts develop slowly without being derailed by interruption. More space for boredom, yes, but boredom that led to creativity, to storytelling, to invention. The modern horror of boredom, the need to be constantly entertained or productive, would have been alien to pre-civilization people. They knew how to sit with boredom, to let it transform into something else, to find entertainment in observation, in conversation, in memory, in imagination. They didn't need external stimulation to fill every moment, because the world itself was interesting enough, provided enough stimulus when you paid attention to it. The play of light on water, the behavior of insects, the patterns of clouds, the textures of bark and stone and hide. Everything was available to attention, and attention wasn't fractured the way ours is, wasn't divided among multiple screens and tasks and streams of information. This quality of attention, this depth of presence, is something many people seek now through meditation or mindfulness practices, trying to recover something that was once natural, once the default mode of human consciousness. We've lost it through the overwhelming complexity and stimulation of modern life. And we feel the loss even if we can't always name it, even if we don't know what we're missing. The world before civilization offered this as a birthright, not something you had to practice or achieve, but simply how you experienced life when life was simpler, quieter, more immediate. This isn't to say it was better, not necessarily, but it was different, and the difference matters. Understanding what we've lost helps us understand what we might want to recover, or preserve, or create space for in our lives, even while living with all the complexity and technology that civilization brings. And now, here we are, looking back across the vast distance of time, trying to see and understand a world that's gone, trying to connect with ancestors whose lives were so different from ours, they might as well be from another planet. But they're not. They're us. Same species, same brains, same fundamental humanity. And this fact matters more now than ever, because we stand at another threshold, another moment of transformation that might be as significant as the transition from pre-civilization to civilization. We're reshaping the world with technology in ways our parents couldn't have imagined. We're connecting globally in unprecedented ways. We're changing the climate, the ecosystems, the very chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans. We're augmenting ourselves with technology, blurring the line between human and machine. We're possibly on the verge of creating artificial intelligence that rivals or exceeds human intelligence. We're looking outward to space, considering becoming a multi-planetary species. The world is changing faster than it ever has, and where this leads, Nobody knows. In this moment of transformation, looking back at the world before civilization offers perspective. It reminds us that human nature is adaptable, that we've survived massive changes before, that we're not locked into any particular way of living. It reminds us that many things we take for granted, assume are necessary or inevitable, are actually choices, historically contingent, potentially changeable. It reminds us that humans can thrive with very different social structures, technologies, relationships with nature. It shows us roads not taken, alternatives to the path we've followed, possibilities that might still be relevant as we navigate an uncertain future. And it humbles us, reminds us that civilization is recent, that most of human history happened without it, that we're still fundamentally the animals who lived in that earlier world, carrying all the adaptations and instincts that developed over hundreds of thousands of years of pre-civilization life. We ignore that at our peril. We succeed when we acknowledge it, work with it, design our societies and technologies around human nature as it actually is, rather than as we might wish it to be. The world before civilization doesn't offer answers to our modern problems. It can't tell us how to address climate change or inequality or political polarization or any of the other challenges we face. But it offers context, perspective, a longer view of what it means to be human, what we're capable of, what we've survived, what we've lost and gained along the way. It offers stories, countless stories of human courage and creativity and resilience, of people finding ways to live meaningful lives in difficult circumstances, of communities supporting each other through hardship, of knowledge being preserved and transmitted across generations, of beauty being created even in the absence of material wealth, of meaning being found in relationship with each other and with the natural world. These stories aren't just historical curiosities. They're part of who we are, part of our inheritance, part of the wisdom our species has accumulated over its long existence. And we need that wisdom now, need to draw on the full depth of human experience, need to remember that we're part of a story much longer and larger than our individual lives or even than the entire span of recorded history. We're part of a story that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, that will hopefully continue far into the future, and every choice we make contributes to where that story goes next. So imagine one last scene with me. It's night, somewhere on Earth, sometime in the distant past before civilization arose. A small group sits around a fire, 20 people perhaps, all ages, families clustered together for warmth. The fire burns bright, pushing back the darkness, and beyond its circle of light, the world is vast and wild and full of mystery. Above, the stars wheel in their eternal patterns, so bright they cast shadows, so numerous they seem to touch each other, a river of light flowing across the sky. Around the fire, people talk, tell stories, laugh at jokes, comfort crying children, share food, tend to tasks. An elder tells a story about the ancestors, about a time long ago when things were different, and everyone listens, absorbing the knowledge encoded in narrative, learning the lessons that have kept their people alive through countless generations. Young people watch older ones work, learning through observation and imitation, preparing for the day when they'll need these skills. Children play at the edge of the firelight, their games teaching them what they'll need to know to survive and thrive. This scene has played out billions of times over hundreds of thousands of years. Different fires, different people, different languages, different stories, but the same essential human experience. Community, connection, survival, meaning. This is what it meant to be human before civilization, and in fundamental ways, this is still what it means to be human. We still gather, still tell stories, still teach our children, still create light against the darkness, still look for meaning in a mysterious universe. The details have changed beyond recognition. The fires are electric now, the stories come through screens, the darkness is pushed back with technology rather than flame. But the human needs, the human patterns, the human heart, these remain the same. We're still those people around the fire, still carrying their legacy, still facing the same fundamental challenges of how to survive, how to connect, how to find meaning, how to pass something valuable on to the next generation. The world before civilization is gone, but its echoes remain in us, shaping us, reminding us of who we are and where we came from, and what we're capable of. And as the fire burns lower, as people settle in for sleep, as the night deepens and the stars wheel overhead, there's a sense of continuity, of connection to the past and future, of being part of something larger than any individual life. The world is big and wild and dangerous. Yes, but here in this circle of light, surrounded by these people who know you and care about you and depend on you as you depend on them, there's safety, warmth, belonging. This is home. This is enough. This is everything. And tomorrow will come with its challenges and opportunities, and you'll face them as humans have always faced them, with courage and creativity and the support of your community. And life will go on, the great human story continuing, generation after generation, fire after fire, stretching back into the unimaginable past and forward into an unknowable future, but always, essentially, human. Always gathering around fires, always telling stories, always surviving, always finding meaning in the midst of mystery. That's what the world looked like before the first civilization. That's what it means to be human. And that's what we carry with us still, even now, even here in this strange modern world so far removed from that ancient firelight. But still, in the end, the same story, the same humanity, the same eternal questions and the same stubborn hope that somehow, together, we'll find answers. There's something else worth saying, something that ties together everything we've explored. When you study the world before civilization, when you really try to understand it and imagine it and feel what it might have been like, something shifts in how you see the present. The familiar becomes strange. The structures and systems we take for granted, civilization itself, begins to look less like the inevitable culmination of human progress and more like one experiment among many. One way of being human that has costs and benefits, successes and failures. You start to notice the places where civilization pushes against human nature, where it demands things from us that don't come naturally, where it creates problems that hunter-gatherers never faced. The isolation despite being surrounded by millions of people. The meaningless labor that produces nothing tangible. The disconnection from nature and from our own bodies. The anxiety about abstract futures that may never arrive. The constant comparison and status competition that leaves almost everyone feeling inadequate. These aren't just personal failings or psychological problems to be fixed with therapy. They're structural issues, places where the design of civilization conflicts with the design of human nature, which was shaped over hundreds of thousands of years for a very different kind of life. And recognizing this doesn't mean we should or could abandon civilization. We can't go back, and most of us wouldn't want to, even if we could. The benefits are real, the luxuries and comforts and security and knowledge that civilization provides. But recognizing the mismatches, the places where we're like fish trying to climb trees, helps us make better choices. We can design cities that include green spaces, that allow connection with nature even in dense urban environments. We can create work that feels meaningful, that produces tangible results, that connects to human needs in direct ways. We can build communities within the larger society, creating small groups where people know each other deeply, where reciprocity and mutual support are the norm. We can reduce consumption, recognizing that past a certain point, more stuff doesn't make us happier and often makes us less happy, weighing us down with maintenance and debt and the need to protect what we've accumulated. We can spend time in nature, disconnect from technology regularly, create rhythms that honor our circadian biology and need for rest and social connection. We can tell stories, maintain oral traditions alongside written ones, recognize the value of face-to-face interaction and shared experience. We can practice rituals, mark transitions, create meaning through ceremony, even in a secular age. We can learn skills, work with our hands, create things, grow things, fix things, engage with the physical world in direct ways rather than mediating everything through screens and services. None of this requires rejecting modernity entirely. It's about integration, about finding ways to honor our deep human needs while living in the world as it is. It's about selective rewilding, bringing elements of the pre-civilization world into our lives, where they make sense, where they address real needs, where they make us healthier and happier and more connected. And it's about humility, recognizing that civilization, for all its achievements, hasn't solved the fundamental problems of human existence, hasn't made us happier or more peaceful or more wise than our ancestors, has just given us different problems to solve, different challenges to face. The people before civilization faced threats we've eliminated: hunger and exposure and predation. But they also had things we've lost: security in community, meaning from direct engagement with survival, connection to nature, freedom from many of the anxieties that plague modern life. Neither world is superior in all ways. Both have advantages. Understanding this allows us to be more thoughtful about what we want to preserve from civilization and what we might want to recover from the pre-civilization past, not through literal return, but through thoughtful reintegration of patterns and practices that served humans well for most of our existence. And maybe this is the real gift that looking back at the world before civilization offers us. Not nostalgia, not romanticization, not a desire to abandon everything we've built, but perspective, context, options. The recognition that how we live now is a choice, not an inevitability, and that we can make different choices, individually and collectively. Choices that honor our nature while embracing our capabilities, that preserve the best of civilization while recovering some of what was lost, that create a future worthy of the long human story that brought us here. The people before civilization didn't have our problems, but they would recognize our needs, our desires, our fears, our hopes, because these are human constants, unchanging across time. And they would, I think, understand what we're trying to do, fumbling toward a way of life that works for beings like us in a world like this, just as they fumbled toward it in their time, with their resources, in their circumstances. We're all part of the same story, all facing the same fundamental challenge of how to be human in whatever world we find ourselves. And there's something comforting in that, something connecting, something that reminds us we're not alone in our struggles, that countless generations faced similar challenges and survived, and their survival is why we're here, why we exist, why we get to face our own challenges and hopefully pass something valuable forward to those who come after us, continuing the long chain, the eternal story, the human journey that began in the world before civilization and continues now and will continue into whatever future we create. Sleep well, friend. Dream of those ancient fires, of people like you facing a wild world with nothing but their wits and each other. Dream of the endless horizons they walked, the mysteries they encountered, the challenges they overcame. Dream of a time before everything got so complicated, when the questions were simple, even if the answers were hard, when survival was the goal, and connection was the method and meaning emerged from the simple fact of being alive and aware in a beautiful, terrible, endlessly fascinating world. And when you wake, carry something of that with you. The courage they had, the creativity they brought to impossible problems, the commitment they made to each other and to the generations that would follow. You're their descendant. Their success is why you exist. And somewhere in you, buried deep, are all the capabilities they had, all the resilience and adaptability and strength that carried them through hundreds of thousands of years of survival. You might never need those capabilities the way they did, but they're there, waiting, part of your inheritance, part of what makes you human. And knowing they're there, knowing where you came from, knowing the length and depth of the human story you're part of, that knowledge itself is valuable, is strengthening, is a gift from the world before civilization to you, here now, facing whatever challenges your time and place present. Good night. Rest well. And remember, you're never truly alone, never truly lost, because you carry within you the wisdom of countless ancestors who survived everything the world could throw at them, and their persistence is your birthright. Their story is your story. Their fire still burns in you, keeping back the darkness, lighting the way forward, connecting past and future in the eternal now of human consciousness and human community and human